Now one day, I was out in the woods by myself, just exploring and pretending to be Indiana Jones or something, and I was coming out of the tall grass. I could see the little back alley in between the parking area and the woods, and I saw something lying in the grass. I believe it's a deer. I think it's just sleeping, so I creep up on it, trying to not scare it. I know, cool. That was quite funny. When I got there, I knew something was off. The deer was too still and smelled horrible. I couldn't see its face, and its back was facing me, but when I got up to it, I nearly had a heart attack when I saw its entire stomach is ripped open. I wasn't a smart kid, but I knew this was messed up. When I turned to run back home to tell my mom, I saw another deer nailed to a tree next to the first. I don't know how I didn't notice this before, but its two front hooves are literally nailed to it. It's a disgusting scene, as you can imagine. As I stood there, staring at it, a car drove past a little alley. I remember it's a white car with tinted windows driving really slowly. I mean, everyone drove slowly on this alley because it's a residential street, but these people were barely moving. I can't see inside, but I got the sinking feeling that they were watching me. Obviously, I can't be sure that they are, but I'm 99% sure it was them. Once they were gone, I booked it home and told my mum the whole thing. She told me not to go in the field again, and I agree. I really hated what I saw. For the next month or so, I saw that car drive everywhere. It would drive up and down the main road I was on while I was playing in the front yard. It would drive down and back towards the alley when I would be back in the yard. I even remembered seeing it at a grocery store once, but they were definitely staking the house out. It was always the white car, tinted windows, maybe they're following me, and always driving way too slowly to be normal. I tell my mum about it, but she chalks it up to a neighbour just going down the road. So one day, my mum was out mowing the lawn. Because of the way the apartment is, she had to push the lawnmower all the way around the apartments to get to our backyard. Being the helpful kid I was going to meet my mum out the back to open the gate so she can put the lawnmower in the shed. As I'm walking out the gate, I see the car come along the back alley. Normally, the car goes slow. As soon as it turns a corner, however, the driver steps on the gas, zooming up behind me. The back door closest to me opens and someone gets out and starts running towards me. I don't remember what he looked like or even if it was a he. I just remembered getting back home as quick as I can, terrified. After that, my dad yelled at me for peeing myself, and neither he nor my mum believed me about the guy in the car, and I never saw him again, and we moved a few months later. That sounds really harsh, Jesus. My parents still think I made up the whole thing, even though they thought how sketchy the neighbourhood was. I don't remember anyone going missing at that time in my town, but I never really looked it up. All I know is it was really messed up, and I have no idea who those people were and why they did that to the deer or what they planned for me. I just hope they never done anything to anyone else. This happened a few years ago, and we didn't know exactly who this man was, but it still scared me senselessly. When I was about 13, I used to have my bed right under my bedroom window. It was also around the time my dog was brought inside because she got too old to stay out. At the time, we didn't have screens covering the doors like we do now, or the windows, so the windows could easily be opened and there's no barrier. I always left my window open during the day to let in fresh air, then close and lock it when it starts getting dark. The house is surrounded by forest, not very thick, but still thick enough that you can't clearly see through it. It's completely normal to hear strange noises at night because things like bears or stray dogs or even former neighbours' chickens would roam around through our backyard. So when I heard something shuffling around my window, I didn't think much of it and continued playing video games. Not even 10 minutes later, I heard something hit against it. It may have just been a large June bug. When they hit a window, it sounds like rocks being thrown, so I literally ignore it. The knocking kept going, but I just kept ignoring it until finally it stopped. Fast forward until around 2 AM. I was finally settling down and going to sleep when I hear breathing. Very faint, enough to miss if my room wasn't silent. I heard something drag down my window, like a stick or finger. I did it a few times, and that was enough for me. I jump out of bed, running to my dad's room. I told him that there was something at my window, and he immediately came to look. We turned on the lights, and nothing's there. I told him what I heard, and he said he's gonna look in the morning. We did just that, and my stomach churned. Under my window, there were two completely different foot tracks, one back and forth besides the generator, looking directly under my window. There's even cigarette butts laying on the floor, and ashes. Like they've been there for a while. The foot tracks led towards the woods, and seemed to stop there. We have no idea who this was, and to this day even thinking of this terrifies me. Afterward we put locks on the windows and screens up, but I'll never forget that day. Okay, so this was a normal rainy evening when I was 14. I played games until my mum come in and told me to go to sleep. But before I get to the creepy parts, I'll give you an overview of our home. Our house is located on a hill. The closest neighbours are literally 100 meters further at the road. This road leads to nowhere, so there are rarely people going past our home. Behind the house is a little forest area that I used to play in as a child. And also, the house has 2 floors. My room is at the second upper floor. Yeah, I gotta admit it's a lonely house, with rain, darkness, and a forest that could keep me a little bit worried if I didn't know what was in there. So I went to sleep as usual at 11 PM. I fell asleep very quickly. However, at 3 AM I woke up, and I didn't do that so often. I think I had to go to the bathroom or something, so I went to pee and look through the window and do my thing. But it wasn't that relaxing nightly forest that I saw. My eyes glued on a specific character in the darkness. A man wearing dark clothes was just standing at the path of the forest. I don't know what he was doing. I started to panic, of course, and switched off the bathroom lights really quick. I sneak up to my parents downstairs, and I've never felt so afraid moving in my home in my life. We had alarms on, but it didn't calm me. I took a look at my parents. They're asleep. My sister's not up either. I went to the kitchen and peeked through the window. There he was, still standing at the pathway, closer now. And now I can see his body. I can't figure out his face. He looks huge. I just sat at the window, scared and almost falling to tears. Little rain poured to the ceiling and made naturally chill sounds. That didn't help. I peeked through the window again, and I almost jump out of my skin when he's standing in the yard now. I can see his face. He looks terrifying. I now ran to my parents to wake them up. My father ran out the back door, but my mum said that he could be dangerous and might be armed. She calls the police. Movement inside the house made the guy move, and he runs towards the road and the forest. My father swore that he couldn't go after him, but was mad that he couldn't. Now we wait for the cops to show up. Eventually they show up and ask questions and check out the forest with my dad. At this point, I went to sleep again with my mum, terrified but managed to sleep. I still have nightmares about this today. When I was young, me and my brother loved to go and play and explore in the forest near where we lived. We had a group of neighbourhood friends that we'd also do this with, and to be honest, those were some of my best memories. However, this would all change one day, and everything seems like normal. We set off on a normal summer's evening, and we decide we're going to play hide and seek. Now, to get to where we play, we have to walk through a bit of a swampland. I say swamp, it's not really a swamp, but it feels very similar to one. So we're walking through this, stumbling around, and finally make it to the giant tree. This is the exact tree that marks the spot where we play. So, I have to look for people unfortunately, but it's my turn, so that's fine. I hide behind this tree and start counting. I finally get to 1 and say I'm ready for you lot. And I burst out laughing when I see one of my stupid friends has literally climbed on top of the tree, hit directly above me, got caught instantly, then starts panicking that he can't get down. I help him down and I say, "You search the left side, I'm gonna go a bit deeper and find these." He says fine. To be honest, more than anything, I can't wait to tell the others how stupid he was. As I'm walking, I see something up ahead. It's a dark figure. I laugh and start sprinting up there. I stumble on the way and hurt my knee though, so I was quite annoyed about this. But by the time I get there, the figure's moved. Now I'm looking around and something feels very odd. It feels like I'm being watched, but not like in hide and seek. This is almost like a much darker, ominous presence is there. I've literally never had a feeling like it since then. So I look around when I see part of a hand. Well, it's not a hand, it's a stick that looks like a hand, but I can make out what it is in the shadows. As I get closer, I see it's holding something. I think that's really odd. I get a bit closer and realise that it's a skeleton hand. One that looks slightly degraded, like it's been there for some time. Halloween's around the corner, so I'm sure it's a Halloween prop. I hold up the piece of paper and look inside. It says run. It's not in any of my friend's handwriting. And then, to my horror, I see a shadow appear behind me. I glance back for a second, and there's 2 giants of men standing there in full camo gear, with smirks on their faces. I drop the paper and let out this blood-curdling scream, and I begin to sprint my way back. I end up going all the way to the tree, and to my horror, I'm met by all of my friends there, who can see how scared I am, and we all sprint all the way back home. When I get there, I explain what's happened, and my brother's so scared he starts crying, where he's younger than me. We're more scared of getting in trouble with our parents, don't even bother telling them. But looking back on it now, I really wish I'd done something more at the time, like told the authorities or something. I hate the thought that there's some twisted, mental people out there that would do something like this. God knows what their intentions were, but I can guarantee you that they weren't good. A little backstory first. I grew up in upstate New York, about 30 minutes north of Syracuse to be exact. It only made sense that I would return to my quiet little part of the world after I got out of the Marines in 2007. The only problem is that I didn't have much money. The good news is that my grandfather had an old pool behind camper that he told me I could have until I got on my own feet. So, Being on my own, I decided I'd spend about a year in the pool, behind on a few acres of woods that I bought from a friend of mine while I was in the Marines. Now all my taxes had been paid for the year, so the only thing I had to do was pay for gas and propane. I managed to avoid looking like a crazy mountain man by showering and washing my clothes at a local truck stop / diner, even getting a pretty decent job working security. I filled the rest of my time working odd jobs for extra cash. Alright, so for the main story. It was mid-April. I was sitting next to a nice low fire while listening to my battery-powered radio, watching nightfall in the woods. I had gotten a nice dinner at the diner down the road, so I didn't have any work for the next few days. Generally, I don't see anyone in the woods for weeks at a time, so I wasn't expecting it when I hear a scream to break the silence. I shot up, grab my shotgun, and get out of the camper and check the chamber to make sure it's loaded. I stood on the edge of a small clearing, strained my ears to listen for any sounds. It's generally hard to pinpoint sounds in the dead of night in the woods, but luckily I hear some shouting and car doors slamming, so I knew that the sounds had to be coming from the main vehicle trail a short distance from my campsite. I made my way to the trail as fast as I could in the low light, and before I get halfway there, I heard another clipped scream to my left. I could hear a rustling in the brush. I slowly made my way there, and to where I think the noise is coming from. I come out of the woods right next to a man who had a woman pinned to the ground, just standing over her. Shaking from adrenaline, I leveled the shotgun at the top of the guy, and the woman growled at him to get off. Now I'm a big guy, but I have no doubt that the shotgun was the deciding factor in this whole situation. Each of these guys easily had a solid 30 pounds of muscle on me when I was a 200-pound Marine. I ushered the two idiots back, so I was between them. The woman's now getting to her feet. It was about now I realised we have another problem. My cell phone was cheap and didn't get reception in the woods, and hers had been broken by these two sickos. There wasn't much I could do other than march these two back to their jeep under the threat of shotgun. I get the license number, and I'm sure it was fake, and a description of them and their vehicle. Before the driver gets in the vehicle, I lowered the shotgun to his crotch and made sure he understood what a 3-inch 12-gauge shell loaded would do. They took off in one direction. Me and the woman made our way back to my campsite. We drove to the DEC station and reported it as quick as possible. It turns out that the guy I had threatened was the young girl's now ex-boyfriend. They'd been out having a few drinks when the third wheel in the situation got a little too handsy for her liking. When she said something to her boyfriend, he basically told her to stop and get on with it for once. When she refused, the boyfriend smashed her phone and pushed her to the ground. They both pushed her into the truck and drove her deep into the woods. She had waited for them to become complacent before throwing the back door open and jumping out and taking off. Luckily, the Jeep was crap and the back door didn't lock. It was a stroke of luck that I happened to be outside when she escaped. Fast forward 7 months, and that woman I helped is now my wife, and we moved into our first house using the money I saved up living in the woods. We've been married for 8 years now, and I have 2 kids, a 6-year-old boy and a 4-year-old girl. I still go out to camp every year to hunt and haven't seen the Jeep or the guys again. We heard through the grapevine that they had been arrested and actually got jail time. I'm assuming they moved to a different area because I never saw them again. I'm a child of the mountains and my hometown was completely mountainous, so I spent most of my childhood running through the forests and stuff. And one event that happened when I was 10 remains unexplained. I was on top of the ridge, several hundreds of feet above my house, when I started hearing my biological father yelling. In a very redneck area, he had a very distinct voice with no accent, so it's not really possible to confuse him for anyone else. His voice was coming from the other side of the ridge, which is a bit weird in retrospect because nobody over that way actually lived in that area and everyone avoided everyone in there. Even when hunting, we'd go around. The train was worse to deal with, but it's what we done. He starts calling my name, so I go down there. But the voice isn't getting any closer. I start feeling dread washing over me, and I suddenly remember my father's on a trip to Germany. I've never ran so fast. I didn't realise it until I got to the other side of the ridge, but the forest had been completely silent on the other side of the ridge, which never happens unless there's predators or the wind picks up. Normally, I'd think I was just getting closer to black bear territory, but the voice obviously makes it confusing. Unlike a number of stories like this I've heard over the years, the experience didn't really stop me from going into the woods. It just made me more curious. I've never had an explanation for it since, and it kind of worries me. The closest thing I've heard it could be is like a skinwalker, but I'm not sure. It may even be a person who is trying to stalk me in, but I guess I'll never know. Hey everyone. About 2 weeks ago, I had a really scary experience and my husband didn't believe me, but last night, he had a very similar experience and now we're both wondering what we could have possibly seen. So our puppy was barking to go outside and use the bathroom. It's about 4 or 5 AM. I took him out and stood on the steps of our deck because I didn't want to get my feet wet. My dog was using the bathroom when I looked up and I see something across the yard. It was slowly walking towards me, one step at a time. Its eyes were super reflective. I thought it was a deer, but its eyes were so tall and staring at me, and it wasn't running away. I hurried the dog up and we ran inside. I have reoccurring night terrors, so at first, my husband thinks it's just that, but I was crying and shaking and could barely be spoken to. He tells me it's probably a deer, but I wasn't convinced, and I refused to take the dog out after midnight again. As for my husband's experience, it was early in the morning, about 5 AM. The dog was barking and he took him outside. Once again, my husband stood on the deck outside. He didn't have his glasses, but when he looks up, he saw something tall standing in the forest near our backyard. He said he saw it walking slowly, almost gliding. He said that the moment he made eye contact, his nose was bleeding. My husband is typically not prone to them either. He said he wanted to get a closer look but felt the need to go inside, almost like an instinct. My husband's a zookeeper. He's not really afraid of animals and can recognize many of them. I still have no idea what this is. We live in Eastern PA. This happened around the 1900s in the countryside of South Brazil. My grandmother's grandfather was coming home from a ball very late at night. He lived in a small farm, and so to come from the party place he had a long way to walk in the middle of nothing, with just trees and bushes. And well, you can imagine how the countryside of Brazil was, especially back then. He said that while he was walking, all of a sudden he heard strange noises and lights. Scared, he hid in the bushes to see what was happening. He said there were very little men speaking in a foreign language. Behind him, there was 2 huge plates stacked on top of another, with lights all over them. He stayed hiding and praying until they left and ran for his life. My grandmother says that she's heard this story a few times in her youth from him, and the narrative always stayed the same, with him praying after. Only after she married and moved to the big city and had children did she start to hear about these things being known as aliens and other things. Her grandfather at the time would have had no concept of aliens. After a heavy night of drinking and camping, we woke up and nobody wanted to make breakfast, so we decided to drive into town and find a diner. We're approaching where the dirt meets the pavement and come up on dozens of sheriffs backloading the road, 2 of which have rifles pointed towards us. We stop the truck about 40 feet from them and hear them yell over the intercom to stick our hands up now. They then instruct us to approach on foot with our hands in the air. They search my truck and find it full of loaded guns and beer. That's when they tell us that a Forest Service agent had been shot and killed nearby, and eventually let us go, but tell us our camping gear is out of bounds until the murderer is found. We didn't want to leave our camping gear and go home, so we ended up at a nearby casino, continuing partying there. A few hours later, someone in the casino says there's loads of cops outside. We go outside and there must have been 100 sheriffs, local PD everywhere. Apparently, that same murderer had stopped at the casino gas station and an officer recognized him. Then LEO drew his gun, murderer went for his and the LEO shot him dead. We went back to the camp and home the next day. I checked the newspaper articles and they made a map of where the murder happened, and it's only 200 yards away from our campsite. I have a friend who's a trail ranger. He's basically a ranger who can't get you in trouble. He told me about this time he was gathering illegally placed wildlife cameras and knocking them down and whatnot. The other ranger wasn't feeling well, so he said he was going to head back, but it's a 1-hour ATV ride. My friend finished up the last one when he hears voices. He kept in mind that he's far off the beaten path. He calls out and no one replies. As it was getting dark, he starts to head back and found his ATV won't start. He then realizes that the batteries are not connected. He reconnects it and started to drive but isn't going fast. Less than half a mile later, the whole thing died. He radioed back saying, "Hey guys, someone pick me up." They said they would do it but are gonna take an hour. He said, "Can the other guy come back?" and he said no. So he settled down, made a small fire, but heard voices again. It's dark and he's angry. The voices sound like an argument now. Someone was angry, yelling at someone else who sounded scared. He called out and said, "Does anyone need help?" The voices don't care. He thinks they're less than 1,000 feet away. He radioed again, and they said they're having trouble finding what path he'd be on, and haven't left yet. He said to them just to get another ranger there. About 3 minutes go by, and the voices start again. He decides to walk there, hoping maybe there's some drunk people that have a map. He walks in their direction, but the voices seem to be getting further away as he got closer. Finally, 20 minutes later, he gave up and walks back. He got a radio call, and they said the other guy was passed out, covered in vomit, and was taken to hospital. They don't know exactly where I come from still because he crossed off everywhere that he went. Then the radio died, and the voices came back. Bored out of his mind, he decides to listen to what they're arguing about, and picks up on things like, "Well, it wasn't yours to take, and I knew you were gonna do this, you idiot, and I don't care." His guess is that 2 hunters are arguing over a kill. Then he heard something intelligible. Then silence. Bang. A gunshot. He doused his fire and hid. After that he heard nothing, just his breathing for the next half hour until he saw ATV lights. He told the guy picking him up everything and they called back. They had people looking for 3 hours but found nothing. They came back the next day with police and dogs. After about an hour, a shallow grave was found and a man who'd been shot in the head was also found. Thing was, it was a skeleton who had been there for years, so either the argument he heard was somehow from the past, or someone else got murdered recently when he was there. This happened while I was doing my army service in Switzerland. I'm not allowed to talk about exactly what we were doing there, but I'll try and keep this clear. My company has installed a huge antenna and it has to be guarded day and night. So we're on a hill, away from a city near a massive forest. It's 1800 hours and I had just started my watch of 6 hours with another soldier. Everything's fine. We smoke cigarettes and keep ourselves occupied until our night watch ends. Then, we receive a call from our superior who said that one of the soldiers that's supposed to watch hasn't come out and we have to stay for another 6 hours. So we tossed a coin to see who's going to stay from midnight till 6 AM with temperatures of -20. And of course I lost. And I had to wait for the other soldiers to come and join me for the rest of the night. They sent Jon Snow. No, I'm just kidding. They've only sent another soldier, but not the best because I knew he would sleep all night when I saw him climbing the hill with his sleeping bag. And that's what he did. He immediately took place in the tent and fell asleep. It was the coldest and longest night of my life. Nothing special about it. The weirdest part though happened in the morning. We received another call from our superior telling us that we had an NBC exercise. It means that we have to wear all-day chemical suits. The one with the gas mask and everything. I was really upset and exhausted because I wasn't able to sleep with that thing on, and sleep was my only reward for the 12-hour watch. Well, I get out of this tent, and I saw this thing that still scares me to this day. I see a woman standing next to the antenna. She wasn't moving, she was just standing there, meters from my tent. I couldn't see her face because of the sun starting to rise behind her. I knew she's a woman because she had really long hair. Remember that we're in the middle of nowhere and she's standing there, not moving like she's frozen. I start to freak out and call the other guy to see what I'm looking at. I don't know why, but he wasn't scared at all, and he told her to leave. But she didn't. She just stood there staring at us. I was confused. How could a woman ignore 2 soldiers in a forbidden area? I mean, we're in Switzerland. The army's not that impressive, I know, but people usually don't do this kind of thing. They would just move away, especially when it's 6 in the morning. And what she's doing in the middle of nowhere is beyond me, not dressed for cold climate. How long was she there? And how did she get there? I don't even see any footsteps. So, there's so many questions running through my head. The other soldier didn't think twice and starts walking towards her. When he almost reaches her, she starts running very fast into the forest. I see her going deep into the forest and I never see her again. I'm a really rational thinker, but I have absolutely no explanation for this. Thank God there was someone there with me because nobody would have believed me if it was just me there at that time. My father told me a story many times when I was growing up of something that happened to him. I know he believes it to be true, and he's not a very superstitious person whatsoever. Very analytical on the other hand. My dad was 5 years old, camping with the Boy Scout troop. They sent everyone for firewood. It was dusk, so he went off on his own and a little further than the other kids. He wanted to gather more firewood than anyone else. He got far enough away that nobody else had picked through the fallen wood and started gathering. Along his way, he went until he almost stepped on a tiny tribe of Indians, moving around a fire, dancing. He said they were tiny, and they didn't pay him any attention as he crouched down to look at them. He ran over to go and tell his friends, but by the time he come back, they're all gone. He said he's never seen anything like it in his life, and he was sure someone was playing a prank on him, but how? How could somebody make a prank look that real? I live near a very large, very popular national park. Locals here, like myself, are pretty aware of the goings on here. Strange sounds, weird creatures, and strange disappearances. I've dealt with these in my past times and hikes, and even just relaxing in the park. Here's one that still freaks me out to this day. I was at my grandma's house that's deep in the Bonnies, and the only road there is a gravel road that's washed away. Without a good car, you're not getting anywhere. My cousins lived in a trailer with their mums, right below my grandma's. We played all sorts of games, which mainly involved me getting chased, being the youngest. My grandma was in hospital with my aunt, so our oldest cousin, who I'll call Dee, had to watch us. Dee was, and still is, the only cousin that's older than us that we still hold in high regards. He would mess with us and play around, but actually cared about us. The whole day we were playing around, but we would usually play more at night, like hide and seek, etc. We've been playing pretty far away from the house, and it was starting to get dark. We decided to go back to the house and grab flashlights and play manhunt. Of course, I was the one being hunted. So I ran pretty far into the woods on the other side of the property, hiding behind a log. I heard my cousins getting closer, so I ran and they saw me. We ended up running to the very back of the property line, and we saw my cousin Dee. He looked at us and kinda growled. We all ran from him, thinking it's a game. We ran back to the gravel road when we saw him walk out of the tree line, but he did in a weird way. Gloatingly, in fact. We ran into the house and decided to barricade the door to play a prank on him. We moved a couple of things in front of the door, but decided to move the big coffee table in front of it too. As we loudly scooted the table, they come into the living room from the bedroom. We had obviously woke him up, and we said we saw him chasing us, and he got wide-eyed. He said stay in the bedroom. We sat in the bedroom for about 20 minutes, and he come in and told us not to worry, that he's just scaring us. It wasn't until 4 years later, when I was 13, he told me the truth. He's pretty certain that it was a skinwalker. He told me he's dealt with it before and was terrified it hunted us, and he was too scared to tell me at the time because I'd get worried. So with a few fraternity brothers and I are backpacking in the Nafala National Park and met some guys. They're locals. I mean, not local hangout bros, but local backwoods people who lived there for generations, hate the government and society types. These are guys that have apparently been helping Eric Rudolph, the Olympic bomber, hide in the national forest by supplying him with food drops. Really weird drunken conversations. They actually took us to one of the hideout drop-off caves. They were too serious, and that's the whole reason that I hated this. They trusted us because some things were said to make them think we're of a similar mindset. Anyway, we parted ways. Spent a few days trying to figure out if it is all lies or not, and that same week, they call Eric Rudolph in the dumpster of a Piggy Wiggly 3 miles from where we met the guys. Every single thing these guys said matched up with the news story. We gave them the bottle of Jack even. They said they'd give it to Eric. creepy as hell. Hauntingly terrifying in retrospect. So when I was about 5 years old, I was at my sister's graduation party. My father had rented out a pavilion at a heavy wooded area of Country Park. I ended up following some kids throughout the forest, and after a while, I realised I wandered too far from the pavilion and started heading back. I remember not being able to find my way back and ended up being lost for around an hour. As I was walking, a man dressed in white from head to toe appeared to me. He said his name was John. I explained to him that I was lost and told him where my family was. I remember him accompanying me throughout the woods, and he had a very comforting presence about him. After a while, I remembered hearing my uncles calling for me from a distance. I turned to tell John that that's my uncle, but he was gone. I turned the other way, and there was my uncle. I'm 30 now, but can't help wonder exactly what John was and what the meaning of all of this was. I guess I'll write what happened in chronological order. To preface this, I should mention that all of this took place back on my reservation. I'm from Algonquin First Nation from Canada. Another thing I should mention is that on the res, traditional beliefs and legends of the paranormal are still a big part of our community. The attitude of most people towards the paranormal is one of assurance. To us, the paranormal is a regular part of our life. We believe in a spirit world, and we believe that sometimes these beings can cross over from their world to ours. Well, I tell paranormal stories to my non-native friends. They're always in disbelief of what I tell them, but they've had no paranormal experiences, unlike me having a bunch, and most everyone I know on the res has had one. I don't really care to explain it, but it is what it is. Anyway, here's the story. This happened in the fall of 2011 when I was 16 years old. I was living in a nearby city with my mum, so I can get a better education than the one I can get at home. But we'd go back every single week to see my dad and little brother. One Friday, during the drive back home, I got a text from a friend of mine. She told me about a party that was happening that night, and she said to me when am I going to be home so they can pick me up. I gave her a time and that was that. When we got home, as soon as we stepped inside the house, I see my dad and cousins sitting at the kitchen table drinking. They're both cops on the res, so usually beers with his partner on a Friday evening happens. Means that they had a particularly tough week at work though. Typically, the toughest cases they deal with are ones around children. So a part of me felt sad immediately that something bad's happened. They both look tired and drained, but they're happy to see us. We say our greetings, catch up a little, and my dad asked me if I have any plans. I tell him about the party and where it'll be, and he and our cousin share a weird look. Why are you guys making that face? Did something happen? I say. I dunno, should we tell her? My cousin said, looking at my dad. He laughed and said, yeah, we probably should, because I'm gonna have to be going to a cottage pretty deep in the woods later that evening. They start off by saying the first strange call they get is on a Monday night. There's an elderly woman saying that there's people outside of her home knocking on all of her windows. She can't see anyone, but there must have been at least 3 people, judging by all the different locations of the knocking. They arrive at the woman's home, inspect all around the house, even the woods, but find nothing. They tell her that it's probably some teenagers playing tricks on her, but sadly there's nothing they can do really, besides patrol the area in case they come back. On Wednesday night, the same woman called again with the same problem. It had been raining that day too, and there was mud everywhere. so they figure at least they're gonna know where they went, but they don't find a thing. This is when they start feeling like something is off, because one of the windows where the woman was, she's adamant that there was someone there, but it's completely impossible to get there without going through a huge puddle. This is when they start to think she's lying, but they just told her the same thing they told her friend a few nights prior. By Thursday night, everyone on the res had been talking about these strange experiences. It turns out that she wasn't the only one experiencing it. She was just the one to call. I mean, all of this is taking place on a res, so it wasn't long before people were linking it to the supernatural. My dad still wasn't sure if it's just a group of teens playing a prank on people, but they get another call from the same woman for the same reason. They rush over there, but are met with the same situation, except this time, the neighbour walked over looking pale as a ghost. That's saying something for him. He says, "Is this about the knock-in?" They notice he's a little shaky. "Yeah." "Did you see something?" They ask him, and he nods and said, "You guys are gonna think I'm crazy, but yeah." And he goes on to explain what he saw. He said he stepped out for a cigarette on his front porch when he heard knocking. He looked around to see where it's coming from, and when he looked to his neighbour's house, he saw it. There's a black figure standing outside of the woman's window. The same one with the puddle, looking at her home. He said it looked humanoid in stature, but completely made out of a shadow. You could tell it was something solid-ish, but you cannot make out any features on it. He stared at it completely in shock, and watched that thing as it knocked a couple of times, then darted around the house knocking on every window, moving so quick it's like a blur, and it went around the house a few times. The man ran across the road into the tree line, behind one tree in particular. The man was frozen but couldn't look away. It then leaned out from behind the tree, staring directly at him with yellow eyes that reflected the light similar to a cat's, and then it smiled, showing its small but numerous pointed sharp teeth. "I almost had a heart attack," he said while it happened. Fast forward to Friday. Stories are being exchanged all over the res about sightings and experiences people are having. On top of that, multiple people are experiencing the knock-in. There's also quite a few sightings with everyone describing the creature in the same way. One woman was bringing her trash to the side of the road, and she thought she saw the woman somewhere in her peripheral vision standing near the trees. She walks back up the driveway and into her home, feeling as though she's being watched. Right before she's about to open her door to go back inside to her home, she looked back and saw two reflective yellow eyes staring at her from the trees, saying it's about 5 feet above the ground. Another couple was driving at night and said they saw a humanoid figure too. "You sure you still want to go to that party?" my dad asked. But my friends were already pulling into the driveway. I gave my family hugs and kisses goodbye, and they told me to be careful, but I felt fine. A common belief among native people is that negative energy attracts negative energy. Therefore, an evil spirit will draw to people with unresolved issues, traumas, and sinners, I suppose. If you're someone who's spiritual, self-aware, and basically a good person, you're pretty good. So I get to the party, and within 20 minutes, the conversation shifts towards the paranormal experiences everyone's having. I'm really curious about what everyone has to say, because they have stories that I haven't heard yet, but my friend, being 17 and all, couldn't hold her alcohol very well, and was crying about how she wishes she was closer with her brother. I'm trying to make her feel better while listening to everyone else's stories. One of the people from the party was related to the neighbour of the woman who was calling the police. The experience really shook him up, and my friend was just explaining everything that was going on. For one, he smudged his entire home, which is something people do for extra protection from the paranormal. He also went on multiple visits to the elders around the community asking for advice. What we do know about paranormal experiences on the res is that they don't happen as much as they used to. If you talk to one of our elders, they'll have endless stories and even more advice to give about how to protect yourself. One of the explanations that was given to us is that the shadow guy is evidence that someone was doing unauthorized shaky tent ceremony. If you don't know what that is, it's basically like an Ouija board session that takes place inside of a tent. People stand around the tent while the medicine man or medicine woman goes inside asking questions. The tent begins to shake and you hear voices of the spirits coming through. I've never personally been to one because we haven't had a good enough reason to make one, but typically our ancestors use shaken tent ceremonies when they're starving in the dead of winter and need some direction on where the nearest food is. My mum's been to one. Her story's crazy. She described hearing multiple men and women only speak in native tongue, and they're upset that people were doing a shaken tent ceremony when they're not on the verge of death. The people there had to explain that they're only doing the ceremony to prove that it was real, as we'd been losing our culture as a result of residential schools. But the spirits are angry, saying that the bridge between the two worlds should never be opened unless necessary, because you don't know who you're talking to. It could be evil spirits. You don't know. Anyway, the elders told him that this spirit crossed over into our world because of a shaken tent ceremony. Someone on the res has been doing them without consultation of the elders, so we start thinking about who would do that without the proper guidance, and so. Then, two of the drunkest dudes say, "Oh, I'm not scared. That thing can't do anything," basically egging it all on, and we're all looking at each other like, why would you disrespect an evil spirit? That's exactly how it's attracted to you. And that's when I decided to leave the sunroom where everyone's hanging out. I went to the living room to console my drunk crying friend when I noticed the rocking chair outside of the porch moving. I slowly moved away, refusing to make direct eye contact, but I do in my peripheral vision. Anyway, I'm inside the cottage and I keep seeing this rocking chair moving back and forth. But another thing we're raised to do in our culture is to ignore paranormal. Spirits feed on energy people give towards them, so if you freak out, if you get angry, if you start crying or yell at it, that's exactly what it wants. It thrives on energy of any kind. So while I knew something messed up was happening, I wasn't about to pay attention. 5 minutes now go by and I still see it out the corner of my eye. That's when my friend screams and she runs on the other side of the sunroom. My other friend, too, sprints to the girl, number 1, who's sitting, and busts through the French doors onto the balcony. All of this happens in a split second, but I immediately go to the patio and ask what's going on. Girl 1 is crying on the couch with friends all around her. She claims to have seen the spirit. She said she was listening to the boys talk about the spirit when she saw boy 2's face as he was looking onto the balcony behind her. She turned around to see what he's looking at, and directly on the other side of the window was the shadow spirit on the rocking chair smiling at her, literally 3 feet away from her. That's when boy 2 sprinted towards it and burst through the French doors. I walk outside to find boy 2, and he's on the lawn, staring into the woods. I call his name and he looks up. All he says is, "Get everyone inside," and the tone of his voice makes me scared. I get all of us inside the cottage. This is when the phrase, "Come at me, bro," was gaining popularity. So you can imagine the drunk kid yelling that into the woods. It's terrible. I eventually get everyone inside. Boy 2 comes inside and tells everyone to clean up and that we should leave as soon as possible. Everyone has trash bags and we're clearing away the beer cans and whatever. Everyone goes inside the cottage, and it's only me and boy 2 in the sunroom now. I look to him for answers and he says, "It's outside." I nod and start cleaning faster. The sooner we're out of here, the sooner we get away from that thing. As we're cleaning in the sunroom, we hear knocking on multiple windows. The entire sunroom's made of glass, but it's dark out, so you can't even see. And he says ignore it. I'm really scared now. Within 2 seconds, someone comes running out of the bathroom and says, "I'll kill whoever's knocking on the bathroom window." But everyone's accounted for. Someone else comes running out of the bedroom saying that there was knocking on the window as well. Everyone's freaking out, and me and boy 2 and our one other friend are the only sober ones now trying to calm people. We get the place clean and get outside and to the cars immediately. Everyone's getting into the trucks and I'm standing there. The guy looks relaxed, then all of a sudden looks worried and shoves me inside his truck. We peel out of there quick. A few days later, I end up hanging out with boy 2 and he tells me the story from his perspective. He said that when the boys started talking about the spirit, it appeared on the rocking chair behind girl 1. He said he made eye contact with it but couldn't look away. They were staring at each other, and that's when girl 1 and boy 2's expression changed. He said it was instinct to defend the people he's with and ran towards it. He said that the feeling he was getting from the cockgee was almost like daring him to do something. He said the second he got up, the cockgee stood up and ran into the woods, disappearing into a blur of the tree line. Boy 2 ran off the porch, looking around the lawn, when he saw it standing there, right next to the woods. It was smiling at him, and he heard it mocking him, calling his name, then disappearing. He didn't see it again until everyone was getting inside the trucks, which explains why he suddenly pushed me inside. He said it was standing on the far end of the truck, super close to us. Later that night, when he dropped everyone off, they realized that they never locked the doors. So he went back to the cottage, but his friend was too scared to go in, so he goes in on his own. But the second he opens the door, he sees that thing standing inside. He locks the door as quick as he can, and they peel out of there. The sightings continued for a few days after that. We definitely weren't the only people on the res to have them kind of experiences. It was the talk of the res. Everyone was curious about what happened. Would it come back? What was it? All I know is that it terrified us, and it's 2018 now, and no one else has seen anything like it since. My husband and I live in central Virginia. This particular part of the state is where Virginia's western mountains just begin rising up from the ground. We live in a rural area. In total, there are 4 houses on our road, and 4 on another road directly behind ours which run parallel. All of these properties sit on at least 2 acres. 2 of them are situated on 5+ acres, so lots of space. Other than these 8 homes, the surrounding area is heavily wooded, but there are a number of footpaths winding through the surrounding woods. The main path is a loop that mends around or through the 8 properties with smaller trails veering off of it. Most of these offshoot trails reconnected in the loop, but some just end. Others, however, continue deeper to the forest. When we moved in 5 years ago, we thought the paths would be perfect for our dog walkers, to use them when she came to let our dogs out during the week. Diane was excited to learn about the paths. She's outdoorsy to begin with, and also lives in a rural area, so her comfort level walking the paths was high. I worked from home one day, but Diane come to walk the dogs anyway because I wasn't sure I'd have a solid break in order to do so. When she arrived, we waved a quick hello to one another, but she knew I was busy, so she leashes up the dogs and headed out. 30 minutes later I took a quick break and was there to greet Diane and the other dogs at the back door. I asked her how the walk went, and she told me about what she found in the woods that day. There was a path she noticed prior to this particular day she had never taken but planned to do so at some point. She noted it was significantly less worn than some of the other trails and assumed this may have been because it is a deeper trail, but wasn't sure. From the main path looking through the trees, she said you could tell this trail eventually reached what looked like a small clearing deeper in the woods. Deciding today was the day, she just headed down the path with the dogs trotting alongside her. The dogs reached a clearing first and stopped. They were focused on something from front of them she couldn't yet see. She reaches the entrance to the clearing and lifted her gaze in the same direction as the dogs, and said the hair on the back of her neck immediately rose. Centered in the clearing was Stump. A few inches from the base there stood perfectly spaced rings of animal skulls. Deers, cows, rabbits, birds and others, some of which she couldn't even identify. On the top of the stump more skulls are arranged, one on top of the other, also in ring formation. She said this arrangement looked like it must have taken hours, being close to 2 feet in height. In some places rocks or sticks were placed to ensure every skull was properly supported. Dane's reactions kicked in, and she bolts back to the trail and then to the home as fast as possible. It's not unusual for my neighbours to hunt. My husband and I frequently hear gunshots on the weekends, especially during hunter's season. Neither of us hunt, so I asked my friend's husband, who has hunted here in his entire life, if something was going on. He said he knew nothing, though, and was as confused as we were. I'm getting kind of worried. I mean, there could potentially be a psychopath or cult out there, really close to where I live. From roughly 2000 to 2005, I lived on the south edge of Northern Virginia. This was a rural area with houses set far apart from each other, surrounded by fairly dense woods. There was a phenomenon that I came to call the woods walkers. Due to insomnia, I had a bad tendency to stay up very late at night, sometimes all the way until dawn. I literally did that yesterday. Frequently I'd leave the window partially open all night to let in a cool breeze. On some occasions late at night, or after midnight, I'd hear something loudly crashing through the woods behind the house. It always sounded like a large man staggering drunkenly through the woods, always along the same path from the same direction down towards the Bull Run River. The leaves would be rustling very loudly, as if a large person was carelessly dragging their feet along the ground. Branches would be snapping as if the person was lunching blindly through the forest. I couldn't tell if it was one person or several, but the passing through the woods always created an alarming amount of noise. I came to expect to hear the woods walkers every 2 weeks or so. After a while, whenever I heard the noise of the wood walkers, I would peer out of the window trying to discern who or what would be making all the sounds at such a late hour. I never saw a thing. No outlines of figures nor a glow from a flashlight or cigarette. The really strange thing about this is that the apparent path they were traversing came from nowhere and went nowhere. They just stumbled through the woods, apparently tearing their own path through the wilderness, going deeper into the woods. It's also bizarre that they would go crashing deep through the woods at 2 or 3 a.m. when it's literally pitch black without a source of light. It seems impossible to me that anybody could find their way through the woods in the dark like that. On one particular occasion, I heard the woodwalkers behind the house. Then I heard a bunch of gunshots from directly behind it. It sounded to me like a handgun, maybe a 9mm or a .38 special. The next morning I wandered around the edge of the yard searching for expended brass, but didn't find anything. I found no traces or signs of anyone, in fact. In the days after the gunshots, I became increasingly determined to solve the strange mystery of the woods walkers. I put a flashlight on the small dresser by my door. I patiently waited night after night to hear the woodwalkers come staggering through the woods, and sure enough, one night I heard the familiar sound of something crashing eerie and slowly through the woods behind the home. I leap up and rush to gather the things I need to carry outside with me as I went to confront whatever it was passing through the woods. I frantically pulled off my sweatpants and put on my jeans, searched for my keychain, then unlocked the lunchbox where I keep my pistol, loaded the ammunition to the pistol and tucked it into my belt. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly descend to my basement, then out to the back door into the backyard. It took me far too long to get outside. Now, by the time I cautiously strode out under the moonlight, I could hear noisy movements of the woodwalkers reaching the distance. I walked slowly and stealthily over to the edge of the woods and pulled out my pistol from my belt. I crept soundlessly down the hill into the dark woods. I positioned myself behind a large tree in case the woodwalkers carry firearms. I peered warily in the direction of the sound. My eyes are strained to see whatever's out there, but I discerned nothing through the shadowy branches of the forest. After a while I point my flashlight towards the direction of the noise and turn it on. My night vision was instantly ruined by the reflection of the light from the tangled mass of trees and branches. I turned the light off and listened to the sound of the woodwalkers fade away. I went back inside in defeat. To this day, I have no idea what they were or why they targeted me. I took a gap semester a couple of years ago and decided that I should take a road trip with a buddy who was also taking a semester off from school. We're from the Midwest and planned our trip to take a big circle from Ohio to LA, up to Portland and back home again. We're outdoorsy guys, so we knew we're trying to hit some wilderness along the way. So we're about a month into the trip and leaving Portland, where we are taking a break from camping every night while on the road. Itching to get back on the road and into the wilderness, my buddy finds that the hike looks interesting. It was an abandoned railroad about 2 hours east of Portland. He found the GPS coordinates on some site and said that there's an abandoned railway with a couple of tunnels and a massive trestle bridge that spanned huge gorges. It sounded really cool. So we drive my Volvo station wagon towards the coordinates. If you've ever been to Oregon, it's beautiful, foggy, never-ending views of thick pine forests. The type of place that you can barely see 20 feet in any direction because of the density of the trees. For the last hour of this 2-hour drive, we're driving on dirt logging roads, haven't passed a single car or seen any sign of life since turning off a rural highway. It was creepy, endlessly dark. Stop. I hit the brakes. My buddy squinting at his phone. Looks like we're at the coordinates. I pull off to the side of the one-lane road and put the Volvo in park. The dense trees are still all around us, but I can barely see up ahead, and there is a linear gap in the canopy. I guess that's the railroad. We hop out of the car and I load up my day pack with my camera, headlamp, water, pepper spray, knife. After second thought, I put the knife in my pocket. The railroad's been abandoned for about 50 years, This means that while you can still see the tracks while standing on them, thick brush has filled it in entirety. It has nearly filled in the space between the rails except for a foot-wide path that has been maintained by elk, deer and bears. I notice my buddy is also looking at a private property sign. This is fading into a tree. He looks at me and I shrug and we start walking. The tracks are dead straight. This means that we can see a couple 100 yards down the center of this valley tunnel of vegetation, as if I'm in a very narrow alley that never ends. To either side, I can hardly see 10 feet in front of me. We walk and walk. Honestly, a boring hike considering there's no view and it was dead straight. But we continue. We know the tunnel's ahead. I kept myself busy trying to pace my stride with each railroad tire. Step after step, we walk about 3 miles away from the car, into the woods. Suddenly I stop and my body bumps into my backpack. I had just looked up from my feet and was staring into a looming tunnel ahead of us, covered in moss. The entrance surrounded a black hole that went right into the mountainside. Again we shrug and turned on our headlamps before going in. Graffiti covered everything that wasn't moss, and moss was straight up covering the areas that are covered by graffiti. Our headlamps are dimly lit, but we can see walls covered with graffiti. I stare eye to eye with a 20-foot wide mummy. Now I can barely see my hand in front of my face because of the darkness, and we couldn't yet see the end of the tunnel. Drips of water echo off the walls and my buddy and I quickly walked down the track in silence. I had my knife out on my side. I was relieved to get out. From the exit of the tunnel I could already see a massive gorge up ahead. The tracks went across a bridge that screamed PNW. It was easy to forget about the creepiness of the tunnel, and I looked forward to busting out my camera. Once I set foot on the bridge, I realised the danger of crossing something that hadn't been maintained in 50 years. The wood was clearly aged and rotten in some places, but the view's incredible. We balanced on the steel tracks and walked over to the centre of the trestle, where we could see the river 500 feet below us. Horrible logging scarred the mountainsides along the gorge. I noticed a place where the boards had broken through. I hope nobody's fallen. Instead of turning back after getting some good shots, we keep going. The sun was getting into late afternoon now, and was blocked by the steep mountains around us. We quickly walked off the bridge and back into the green tunnel, but for some reason, I started having second thoughts. I don't know why or where they came from, but I slow my pace and start thinking about how can I ask my buddy to turn around. Before I was going to turn around and ask Nate, I glanced up ahead at the tracks. Directly ahead, about 200 yards away, someone's eyes are looking at me. I stop in my tracks and feel a cold rush to my hands and head. The person staring has stopped now. I see another man's head poke around. It's 2 of them, I whisper to Nate. Slowly we start walking down the green tunnel towards the men. They're walking towards us. As we get closer, I walk faster out of fear. Bouncing on my man's chest is a large bush knife. He's wearing filthy clothes, has a long matted beard, and has not broken eye contact. A revolver is tucked into his pants, and he's carrying a rifle with a magazine. At this point, it's too late to turn back, and I realise that my buddy and I are going to have to squeeze by these men through the narrow gap between the tracks. The brush is pulling up my sleeves. How's it going? I ask nervously, as I squeeze by the men holding eye contact. I count 4 guns and the stench of body odour. I'm unsettled by the way these guys look. I got a gut feeling I've never felt before. They say nothing can go past us. I kept hurrying away, and before I know, they're out of sight when I look behind me past Nate. I turn to Nate and give him my what the hell look. After walking silently for 10 minutes, we stop. I didn't know what to say. I didn't want to walk deeper in, but I also didn't want to walk back towards where the creepy dudes are going. Suddenly loud moaning and shrieks start coming from the dense woods off to the side. It sounded like it's 100 yards away. It doesn't sound human, but it sounds like it's in agony. This is the final straw. We bolt back towards the car. I'm no runner, but we ran over the bridge like my life depended on it. Through the black tunnel and through the endless green that surrounds us. Finally I see the logging road up ahead where the car's parked. I start running where I hear a truck idling. I can start to see it through the brush. A big old F330 lifted pickup truck idling behind my car. The station wagon looks comically small in comparison. I can see the two men sitting in the truck with the doors open and guns out staring at us waiting. Nate and I both shrug to each other, but this time with fear in our eyes. Just get in the car, I scream. We hop in, and I stare at the men in the rearview mirror. We wait. My heart is pounding. Are they gonna kill us? I think they might do. I grab the knife and pepper spray. After waiting for what feels like an hour, the men haven't taken their eyes off of us and we can't back up given how close they are. I notice a fairly solid looking shoulder to the side of the road on my right, and I decide to try and pull in to do a quick U-turn to get away. So that's what I did. Turned the wheel all the way and floored it. Thankfully my car made the turn and was able to clear the back of the truck. We drove as fast as we could down the logging road in silence. No truck behind us. Dust pluming as we ride away. I drive all the way back to Idaho that night and had my eye on the rearview mirror the whole time. So this happened last year in Virginia, and is also the reason I never backpack alone anymore. I was talking to one of my friends and ended up taking a summer course at the time, and we ended up with a 3-day weekend in June, so I thought it was a great time to go and explore some of the Virginia wilderness and all. I did a Google search and found a state park with a trail that looked nice and let my roommate and family know that I'm going to be going on a certain trail. When I got close to the park area, I saw a little outdoor shop where people liked hiking the Appalachian Trail stop. I went in to grab a map of the area just in case I get lost. As I was talking to the owner, he mentioned a trail that's not very well known but has a pretty cool waterfall and swimming hole. This piqued my interest, so I showed him my map and he pointed to where it was. It took me outside the state park, but he said it's a great place to go. I paid for the map and thanked the owner. I texted my roommate and parents about the trail, and I parked my car and set off for the adventure. I should note that the waterfall was going to be a side trip from my journey. I was planning 3 days and 2 nights. I started on the Appalachian Trail and it was pretty packed with people, and some of them were really fun to talk to. As expected, as I got further and further from the main trails, I see less and less people. Around early afternoon, 3 miles from my destination, I noticed it was unnaturally silent. No birds, no bugs, not even wind. I had a feeling of being watched. I shook it off as me overanalyzing the situation. I got to the waterfall and it wasn't too spectacular, but it was cool to look at. Plus it had a good sized area to swim in, so naturally I stripped down to my bare minimum and went swimming. It was pretty refreshing. As I was getting my clothes back on, I started whistling to myself. That's when I heard something whistle the same tune back. I thought it's a bird copying me, so I went back and forth with it, and it will repeat whatever I whistled. I thought it was pretty neat. As I was setting up camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, and again, I'd get goosebumps and my hairs would stand up. As night fell, I built a small fire and lit my jet boil to make dinner. As I did so, I became hyper aware that I was being watched or that something was wrong. I then realised that there was no sound, only deafening silence. Some part of my brain was telling me that I'm not safe and to leave. I just ignored it and crawled into my tent with my flashlight and book. I went to sleep without incident. When I woke up the next morning, my sight was trashed. My camp stool was nowhere to be found. My bear bag with my food was cut down and the contents were thrown across the site. Now my first thoughts are that a crafty animal has actually chewed through the rope and got to the bag, but I look at the rope and it was cut with something very sharp. Plus none of the food was touched. I also noticed bare footprints around my campsite. Keep in mind I'm at least 6 to 8 miles from a road. As I was looking at the mess, I heard a branch snap off in the distance. I turned to look and see nothing. I look again. I still see nothing, but I heard whistling again. The same whistle from yesterday, but it was different. It sounded more sinister. It made my hair stand up on the back of my neck. And this is when I listened to my instincts to get out of there. It sounded like it was a little off in the distance, so I packed up as fast as I could. The whistle got closer as I finished stuffing the tent into my bag. It didn't bother me that I wasn't putting stuff away properly. The whistling was constant and sounded like it was coming from all directions. I got fed up with the whistling and yelled into the woods, "Shut up and do what you want." It stopped whistling and it gone back to being quiet for a moment. Then it repeated in my voice. It sounded like me but distorted, like coming from an old TV. After I heard this, I immediately threw my pack on and ran the direction I came. I heard it moving just behind me, fast, switching and whistling in my voice. I felt like it was toying with me, not coming too close, but not being too far. Eventually it sounded like it got further and further away from me, when it suddenly stopped. When it stopped, I stopped and turned around. I wished I didn't because I heard the most bone-chilling screech I've ever heard coming from right next to me. That's when I started running back. Less than half a mile into the run, I see a couple that was also backpacking. They saw the look of terror on my face. They asked me what's wrong, and saying who is screaming and if I'm okay. I tell them what happened and they decide not to go down there or where I just come from. We moved to a more populated area of the trail. As soon as I got back to my car, I drove to the park ranger station reporting what happened. Since the site was off of their area, they couldn't even do anything. The ranger station parking lot ran right up to the woods. When I was getting into my Jeep, I heard the Chill Bill tune coming from the woods just in front of me. I never drove so fast in my life. When I told my roommate why I was back, he said you should never go there alone again. The weirdest thing that ever happened to me was one day while I was backpacking through the woods. I can remember I went to lean up against a tree and stop for a moment. There was a huge tree I was leaning against. As I do so, I hear someone scream my name. I look around and it's coming from in front of me. I get up and immediately run towards the area, thinking maybe someone I know is in trouble. Just as I do, I hear the loudest crash behind me that I've ever heard in my life. and to my disbelief, the entire tree that I was just leaning on has come down directly where I was sitting. I don't really believe in the supernatural, but I'm sure my guardian angel was there with me. Every summer or so, my family travels up north to our friend's property. Father's old boss, to be exact. He lives on a rather large 80 acres of Washington woods, half of which is his gold mining operation consisting of many old machines and gigs. The other half, dense thick woods, unoccupied and closed off to the public. Curiosity and integrity brought both of us together. We do lots of hikes on the property where it's unkept and overgrown, just to see what's there. After all, nature is wildly beautiful. One warm day we began the uphill hike to explore the woods, only to come across a trail that looked rather frequented, even being at quite a high altitude in the middle of nowhere. Following the trail, we stumbled across lots of old tools left behind by miners on the way back. Then we saw cabins, not one, not two, but three. These cabins were nearly collapsed and very old. Fears and dangers aside, we had to explore them, of course. While going in one at the time, we stepped into a very surreal world. Old bottles, bed frames and vintage stoves, probably all from the late 18 to 1900s. One of the old cabins, unfortunately, was far too unstable to look in. The experience as a whole was like stepping back 100 years and seeing how these men worked hand and foot for gold, leaving all of this stuff behind. Another experience on this property was of seeing the aftermath of one of America's most disturbing times, slavery. Near our campsite lay thousands, and I don't exaggerate, thousands and thousands of boulders, each weighing 100 pounds. The owner of the property tells me that many years ago, in the early days, hundreds of Chinese slaves were forced to move these boulders from dig sites around the property, all converting to one spot. While to you, I'm sure it does not sound that creepy, but the emotional gravity you experience while standing on a mountain of boulders easily 20 feet tall that someone's forced to move and make by hand is not something I would want to convey accurately. I do camp on his site often despite the multiple hour drive, and every time I pass those damn rocks I'm hit with heavy feelings of sad emotions. I had recently discovered that I really enjoy driving the slew of back roads that twist and wind through the hills around the Blue Ridge Parkway. One particular stretch nearing the Blind Rock and Bone has about 18 miles of unbroken mountain driving. It's such a noodle spill. It takes a good 45 minutes to navigate through the switchback. I don't know why they described it that way. One morning, I was out on a sunrise drive along that particular stretch. Keep in mind that the sides of this two-lane road are a rock face to one side and a sheer drop to the other. There's very limited opportunities to turn around in the entire 18-mile stretch. If you're forced to turn back, it's a pretty risky three-point turn, and there's no pulling off to the side and whipping around real quick. Well, I was about 6 miles in. It's about 6:30 AM and I hadn't seen another soul out driving the back roads to this day. As my tendencies lean, I was tearing through the curves about as fast as I can manage without risk. Out of nowhere, a black Cadillac rolls up. I didn't see it come up behind me, it was just kind of there. I'm already breaknecking down this road and he's down on me. The windows are tinted very dark, so I decide to pull off along the cliffside and let the vehicle pass. As it did, I could see nothing of the occupants, That's when I noticed the plates. The numbers looked as though they're changing, like a digital clock gone haywire, and that's if you can call it that. I didn't recognise a single character that was blipping in and out. I sat there for a second and gained my composure. It didn't seem right, but I figured maybe it's just a trick of early morning fog lights. I got back on the road and began to drive. Not a mile later, a black Cadillac comes once again roaring up behind me. It had the same blacked out windows, same everything, right down to the flickering license plate, but it could not be the same one. I would have definitely seen it turn around to get behind me, but this is different, yet fully identical to the first. At this point, I'm just confused more than anything. Stranger things happen than this, so I let it pass and proceed onwards. About a mile later, I see it appear in my rear view, and I mean appear as if I wished it into existence. It was suddenly just there, identical to the first. It happened twice more that drive, and I've never seen anything like it since. I have this thing when I'm sleeping in the wilderness, like if bears or predatory animals are near or watching me, I sense it, first like a dream, but more of an intense awareness that wakes me up. I felt this thing watching me as I woke up and saw it. It took the form of the lady that was camping in the same campground, but it wasn't her. It wasn't human at all. And it had this horrible, evil, hungry, almost grinning expression that is difficult to describe. It was just staring at me, and I just felt like it wanted in. It wanted me bad. As this was happening, I realised my friend's awake. I was just starting out on the trip when I heard him say from behind me, "Can I help you?" I look over and he was starting to stand up with a knife, looking in the same direction as the thing. At that moment I was like, oh god, it's real. I was looking like, dude, what the hell's going on? But he says nothing. He said, go back to sleep. I lie awake until the sun comes up. He didn't really want to talk about it, but he finally told me he heard this huge heavy stomp coming towards our tents with chains, and when he got up, he looked at whatever this thing was, and it's sort of a luminous whitish hazy figure. When he confronted it, it vanished. This happened on the Green River in western Washington. This site was an old mining town back in the 1800s, and there was an explosion caused by a miner that went crazy and purposely set the mine on fire with hundreds of miners inside. Now, I didn't learn about the history of the place until after I'd already went there. The Green River serial killer was also active at the time I was camping there. So this story was told to me by a childhood friend's dad. Me and my friends had known each other for quite some time. Most of the time he lived in town. This is an 8,000 populated town, literally in the dead center of Illinois. On the edge of town, on a country highway, there's a remnants of a small pig farm and slaughterhouse which is now run down, the land of which his family used to hunt on in the 80s. Cue our 8th grade year, and he tells me he's moving out of the country to a new neighborhood that is being built, upscale homes. His dad has been promoted at the local power plant. That's a mile from the slaughterhouse. I started staying out at his gas much more than usual because, well, it's awesome. Lots of money went into it. We would explore the woods during the day. This was in about 98 and 99. We'd then spend our nights listening to music and messing with the Yahoo group chats. Anyway, one day out in the woods we come across a pond of decent size, and there's an island in the middle. My friend sees this and immediately goes pal, tells me we gotta go and hightails it without telling me why. I keep asking him what's going on, but he won't answer me. We finally get back to his house and his parents are settling in. We then come through the garage. They see his face and ask what's wrong, and he tells his dad he found the pond. His dad looks sick, and again I say, what's going on? Now his dad is pretty straightforward, not really a sense of humour kind of guy either, and would only enjoy a glass of expensive whiskey in the mood. He decides now is one of those moods. After getting his glass and taking a sip, he makes us promise to stay away from there, telling us his story. When he was younger, his dad took him and his brother to hunt out there. This incident happened when he's about 19 and well seasoned. They got out there early and decided to set up by his pond. Slow day, only a couple of deer that weren't worth seeing. Started to get the idea of going to a new spot. They then hear a rustling from outside the pond across from them. It's a wolf. But those aren't here. Not a thing in our area. At least not capable of walking to the pond. Looking at it while investigating, it stands up on its hind legs. It walks back the way it come into the water, swim into the middle, but walked up to the island now, again on its legs, standing up before lying down and appearing to fall asleep. They decide to wait to make sure it was out, then slowly back out, getting back to the truck as quick as possible, never going back there to hunt again. Again, this was told to me quite some time ago, but it's always stuck with me. My friend's dad never joked with us. He never seemed to have much of a sense of humour at all, never scared of anything, and never made another person laugh. It really terrified me, seeing everybody look so scared when I had no idea what was going on. A few years ago, my friends and I went on a 45-mile 3-night kayaking trip down the Green River in Kentucky, which runs above the Mammoth Cave System, the world's longest known cave system with more than 400 miles of passages. We brought everything we needed in our kayaks and one canoe, food, tents and water filtrations, etc., and camped each night on the riverbank when it started getting dark and we found level enough ground. The first night was uneventful, except to say there is nothing like a wall of fireflies against a mountainous black tree line in the middle of nowhere. The second day around sunset, after a long day of kayaking and baking in the July heat, we came off on a stream on the bank that opened up into a large ravine. The stream, as we found out, was a cave spring pouring out blue freezing cold cave water into a lagoon, about 30 feet wide, and so deep the blue water turned black after a few feet. The lagoon had a long sandy beach, secluded by hills on either side and a tall overhang cliff behind and above us. It was beautiful, otherworldly looking. Time moved slowly there. We decided to camp there for the night. The sand is soft, white and very fine, ideal for ground sleeping. For some reason the place deeply frightened me, but I didn't speak up. We're all tired and everyone's having fun. We built a small fire and enjoyed the stars throughout the leafy canopy for a while before everyone goes to bed. I slept hard that night, around 5 AM. I woke up with an urge to relieve myself. It's still dark. I had the tent door zipper about halfway opened, and just put my head out when I heard a loud and terrifying roar and scream. I immediately cowered back into my tent, zipping it up quick, and waited. The scream came from about 10 feet to my left, near the dwindling fire. It's high-pitched, but not like an owl scream. It was a wretched pain scream that got lower at the end. Being in the middle of nowhere in Kentucky, most likely It's from a fox or boar, or some kind of bird, but whatever it is, it made me lay awake for hours listening. I heard absolutely nothing. Granted, we're on a soft beach, but I didn't hear a single twig snap or a leaf crinkle when whatever it was finally shuffled away. I should mention at this time that up the beach and off to the side of the lagoon was a small dry cave opening maybe 3 feet wide. I cannot say with any certainty that it was not some ancient cave-dwelling creature that surfaced to investigate our camp. I somehow fell back to sleep and awoke the next morning shaken. I asked my friends if they've heard the terrible scream, but nobody has. We pressed on down the Green River. The third night at dusk, we came upon a large rocky beach. We pulled our boats ashore and decided that this will have to do, as we don't want to go in further and get the risk of being stuck in the water at dark. This rocky beach was where the river splits in two, and in the middle formed a collection of pale rocks, tall grass and dried out wood. A desolate pile with much the size of a football field. The landmass is covered in jumping sand spiders and tiny frogs, again otherworldly. We set up camp, ate, and went to bed around the same time. It's silent for around another half hour until I'm asleep. Suddenly though, my dreams are interrupted by what sounded like a loud boom, mechanical wooden beast. I awoke and shot up immediately. This is truly the loudest thing that I've ever heard in my life. It sounded like a massive bulldozer tearing down a huge steel wooden building. Then came a boom, followed by its echo throughout the river valley. The animal shifted and the birds flew away. We're all awoken by the crashing, yelling and confusion to each other in our tents. Nothing but silence followed outside our tents, and no one was particularly willing to shine a flashlight towards the woods. Eventually, we all decide it's a fallen tree and go back to sleep. The next morning, I thought about it some more. It didn't sound just like a tree falling. I must stress it had a metallic quality, and it was projected purposefully like a roar. In the morning, we find no evidence of anything out of the ordinary, nor any obvious fallen trees that could have made such a loud sound, so we pack up and head out onto the river one last time to head home. My friends and I still talk about that trip and all the weird things that happened. We did the same kayak trip a couple of years later, and nothing out of the ordinary happened. I'm an avid hunter and love to go hiking, so the outdoors is nothing new to me. For as long as I can remember, I've been exploring. I love all the different things you can find outside. I like the smells of the plants, the sounds of the creatures, the nightfall, and how beautiful the stars are outside. I really think I've learned a lot about myself through camping. I'm really improved on lots of different aspects of my life. Now, there was one night about 3 years ago, I went out camping on my own. I wanted to work on some of my primitive hunting skills and just get away from the stress of life. I've been working so hard and felt trapped for a while, so finally getting out was a great thing to me. And I was having a great day. I caught some small animals and was cooking them on my fire. I'd done some reading and wrote in my notes. Something else that helps clear my mind. Now I looked towards my fire and realised that it's starting to go out a bit. So I put some firewood on and decided to trek out and try and get some more wood before nightfall. I know there's going to be a couple of potentially dangerous animals, but I'm not scared because I have my gun and I've seen none in the area. So I begin trekking out when something catches my attention not too far in. There seems to be a hunter's cabin up ahead. I think that's odd because I've never really seen anything like it before. I call out and say, "Hey, is anyone out there?" half expecting someone to be like, "Yeah," and have a good conversation with me. But I'm wrong. I'm only met by my own echoes. I have my gun holstered so I don't feel too scared, and I slowly make my way up there. As I'm going up there, I can hear a voice now, very faintly, almost like a whisper. I just assume it sounds more distant because I'm further away. I eventually get there and am disappointed to discover that it's been abandoned, and I mean for a long time. It looks like this place hasn't been used since the 1950s at least. I look in there and there's not much. An old banjo, decaying massively, unplayable, small pictures that you can't see into, and some mouldy cups. I decide to leave. Luckily I find some firewood just close to it. I'm glad I got firewood and can go back to my camp. I don't realise how dark it's gotten outside. As I'm returning, I start to hear a sound. I think, oh, that's weird, my phone's playing music. I then glance down and realise that my phone's still off. I've kept it this way to conserve its battery, so I stop for a moment. I then realise what I can hear is almost like a stringed instrument. It sounds like it's coming from behind me. I then hold my breath to be dead silent, and what I hear, I still have no explanation for to this day, and shakes me to my core even thinking about. I can hear the sound of a banjo being played from the cabin. I'm so scared that I don't even bother gathering up my things. I simply run out of there back to my car, and have this horrible feeling that I'm being followed the whole way back home. I to this day will never go camping in that part of the woods again. It's the most scary thing I've ever experienced in my life, and I never want to feel again. I had a bizarre experience while I was camping on Cadillac State Park Beach. It's a small stretch of beach with a lagoon on one side and the Gulf of Mexico upon the other. I was setting up closer to the Gulf side, enjoying the stars, just relaxing in my tent at night. This is towards the end of a solo cross-country trip I was on. I had camped all over the country over the previous 35 days, and had never experienced anything too scary happening to me. But while I'm laying there, almost simultaneously, the wind goes completely dead on the ocean. No crashing waves, no sound whatsoever. I never truly understood the term deafening silence until that moment. For some reason, my body's response was complete and utter fear. I don't know why, but it's the most scared I've been along the entire trip. I was waiting for something horrible to happen. I had no idea what, but my mind was telling me that something bad's about to happen. But less than a minute later, all the noise returned. Definitely the weirdest thing I've ever experienced. One afternoon, I was completing this 14-kilometer, 5-hour hike on the edge of town. It's an unkept track at uneven ground, overgrown, and in many places you rely on coloured markers nailed into trees because the track's covered in grass, and it's not the easiest hike. and it's into some pretty unforgiving terrain. We're all wearing hiking shoes, long pants and long sleeve shirts to minimize the risk of snake bites, etc. We're the only people on the track that day that we saw. It's late afternoon and we're about 2 kilometers from the remote trailhead. We're coming up onto this ridge and see someone heading for us. He's wearing weird clothes that are very tattered. He approaches us on the track with wild hair and says hello, but doesn't ask for a reply, simply looking straight ahead, continuing wandering the track. He has no bag or clothing other than some tattered shorts. By the time we get back to the car, it's dark. We hung around for a bit packing up the car and don't see him again. What's more weird is there's no other cars here. The country is very unforgiving. There's no easy way you can loop back to civilization. All he has is one hike stick. I've never seen anything like it to this day, and I can only assume he's a crazy person out there, living off the wilderness. I had a relative that would seek out ghost towns, and I went with him on a few of his excursions. Most of the time, you would find one that is relatively well known. Things were overgrown, etc. But there would always be signs of squatters / campers and hunters or vandalism. One time, he found out about a very small town that was abandoned in the 20s. After a ton of research, he loaded up supplies and planned to hike there to see if he could find it. After several unsuccessful attempted solo hikes, he brought me along. The hike starts out at an old abandoned railroad junction that itself was 5 to 10 miles off the road. We followed a rail line for about 5 minutes. It kept diminishing as we went. Eventually we get to a point where there was no longer any signs of the railroad line and we keep going. He's an experienced hiker and he had a plan where he wanted to go this time. After about 15 or so miles we found it. The town itself was very small. I think there's about 5 houses and a really small general store. One of the houses is in really decent condition. A couple of them have abandoned really quick. Furniture and pictures are left behind. Clothes and other belongings packed but not taken. Almost surreal. We later found out it was dated 1922. The store had some product left on the shelves, but this was not like a store in the traditional sense. It's better described as a trade-in post. There's a few advertisers' signs and a few boxes of soap flakes and canned items that we can't make out. I guess the story was that the town existed because it was on a rail line. There was a grain storage facility that was originally located a few miles away from the rail line. My uncle speculated that people in town either owned or ran the grain facility. The grain facility burnt down to the ground and was diverted away with the rail line, thus the town died. Or it could have been that the rail line diverted and then the grain facility burned down later. Like I said, I've been to a few ghost towns before. This was unlike anything I'd ever seen there. The people that lived there were relatively well off. It doesn't appear to be a farming community. Everything looks frozen in time. There's no roads nearby. The closest paved road's probably 30 miles away, and it looks like no one's ever seen this before but us. When I was a kid in the mid-90s, my friends and I were hiking around in the woods behind our house on what is home a timber property and found an abandoned farmhouse. The weird thing was that the house had been left so abruptly. There was still an open mail, a magazine sitting on the coffee table, all dated back to the same date in the 1950s. Sheets and blankets still on beds, clothes still in drawers, pantry full of canned and jarred food. Half of it exploded or leaked, dishes in the sink even, unburnt candles sitting out waiting to be used. A fridge outside full of food that had been turned to muck and dust. After years of exploring, we'd never come across anything like this. Even the chicken coop had dozens of skeletons in it. There's even pig skeletons left in the pen. A tractor was parked in the garage and was in great shape for its age. It didn't occur to me as a kid at the time, but aside from the house having been left so suddenly, it was remarkable that the place had been undisturbed. There was no vandalism, signs of entry as far as I could tell. We were the first people to step foot in there for 40 years. Not really camping, but as kids, we lived in a new neighbourhood. It was next to about 40 acres of woods and farmland. There were several abandoned houses and barns, equipment and random junk. It was great to grow up there, as we spent nearly every day exploring the area. But there was one house off the main road, about 200 yards into the woods. It looked abandoned, but a woman lived there. We found out the hard way by trying to get into the house one day. She came out screaming at us. She was scary as hell looking, wearing a dirty dress, gross hair, looking like she's never had a shower. Needless to say, we stayed away from her most of the time. We also never told our parents because we knew they'd never let us play back there again. We did go back though sometime, naming her Crazy Mary. We'd spy on her and dare each other to get as close as possible. Even then, never getting closer than 100 feet from her home. About 12 years later, I am home from college and my mum tells me that they took this woman to a mental place. Apparently she lived there the whole time with her dead mum and dad propped up in chairs in the living room. The figures had been dead there for 15 years, dying of natural causes and being propped up by Mary. That means that they were probably freshly dead when we got chased away all them years ago. One of the most surreal things I experienced was while camping. It happened about 2 years ago. I was out collecting firewood. I remembered I forgot something and had to go back to my tent. The second I step out again, it's like the world stopped. There's no sound at all. No birds, no wind through the trees, no bugs or cars in the distance. Nothing. I was the only thing making sound, as though someone pressed mute on a volume dial. Inside my tent's fine, just not outside. After being outside for 10 minutes or so, it's like an explosion of sound happened. Suddenly birds are chirping, the wind is blowing through the trees and I can hear everything again. Truly an unreal experience. My family used to camp in Angolian Park in Ontario when I was a kid. We used to do a lot of the day hikes with our dog. The dog was a crazy runner and run up and down the trail, back and forth between my parents and my brother and me. This one trail ended at a lookout. My brother and I stopped to take in the view, and my dog arrived seconds later running at full speed. He attempted to apply the brakes, but he had so much momentum carrying him that he goes right over the edge. We freak out. Our dogs just went over a cliff, and it's a good 60-foot drop. I venture over to the edge to look, and my dog somehow landed on one ledge that sat about 10 feet down. Now what? At any moment, my dog will fall the rest of the way down. It's a sheer drop with no way back up. Then out of the blue, from the trail behind, a hiker appears with full climbing gear. Now I've never seen anything like it before. The guy goes down, saves my dog, and packs up and leaves. He didn't even stick around to say his name. To all intent and purposes, he returned to the trail and vanished. One of my friends went on a solo fly fishing / camping trip for a weekend. He's in the middle of a creek fly fishing and kept on hearing this weird garbling sound coming up from the creek. So eventually he decided to check it out when he took a break for lunch. It turned out to be a homeless guy that tried to commit suicide by shooting himself. My friend hauled back to call 911 and had to hike back in to show the cops and medics where the guy was, but he was never found. My buddy was so freaked out that he just laid there for hours not knowing what to do. I was camping at Yellowstone / Grand Tent a few years ago. We set up our camper at an actual site and decided to do some 2-day-long backpack trips in some of the longer trails. The second one was the Cascade Canyon. Actually beautiful. So we get about 10 minutes into the 22-mile loop and decide to set up our tent here since it was getting dark. We cook some food and chill for a bit before heading back to bed. It gets to around 2 AM and we're suddenly all awoken by some sound outside. My mind immediately goes to bears. Then it starts talking. I'll never forget it. I think there's 3 or 4 in a tent. Let's just go out, someone said. None of us can sleep the rest of the night. At the crack of dawn, we hightail it out of there. Hike 12-ish miles into about 3 hours and get to a ranger station, reports what happened. They said they had received a similar call the night before. They sent a ranger down there. I never found out what was going on. Didn't hear anyone getting hurt. But then again, I didn't want to look into it. In my college days, now 20 years ago, me and my friends often took off to the North Georgia mountains on the weekend. We wanted to smoke, drink and commute with nature. These mountains were perfect. One weekend, however, this unsettling event occurred to me. My friend Bill and his German Shepherd Monty headed out towards Sky Valley. It was the beginning of the fall semester at UGA, and not much was going on yet. We had found an area where a dirt road led back half a mile, and then we would hike in another mile or so and set up near a creek. Excellent trails were nearby with fun places to explore, not to mention flat ground perfect for setting up camp. Bill and I arrived at our spot at around 4 PM and we got a fire going. We were musicians, Bill playing a guitar and me being a percussionist, so we started jamming. After 10 minutes, we chatted about life and girls before tucking in for the night. It was a clear night, so we just slept under the stars. It is important to take note that we have not seen any sign of any other people in the area during any of our other trips. At about 2 in the morning though, I'm awoken by Monty growling, a deep growl that I've never heard before. Bill was still dead to the world, that'd be me. And I sat up and look around and listen, thinking maybe an animal had come to our campsite. The fire was only embers at this point. I hear barely audible voices in the distance. Focusing on the area of the voices, I see a faint red glow, followed by another faint glow to the left of the first. This is about 100 yards away, my mind connecting what I'm seeing. Cigarette embers burning that are approaching us. "Bill, wake up!" I whisper. Bill rose from his sleep and has no idea what's happening, and I explain to him. At this point, Monty started barking as the strangers approach our camp. Now around this time, the others stood up, who were completely unfazed by our now rabid 80-pound German Shepherd, and we see two incredibly unkept late 30s or 40s looking weird guys. Bill told Monty to calm down. I'll never forget the look of these guys, skinny as hell, about 5'8", looking like something out of a swamp horror film, and probably 5 teeth between them, each having huge knives attached to their belts. "What you boys doing out here? Looks like you're having fun," they said. We responded and told them that we had been out there to camp and drink some beer, then asking for one, to which we gave them. They said did we want to hang out with them, and we declined, saying we have to be out early. Now throughout the conversation, anything Bill or I said, they looked at each other before responding. Finally, before leaving, one of them said, "You'll stay safe. You never know who you could run into out here," and winked as they walk away laughing. We pack up a few hours later and leave, and never went back there again. The fact that we're only awoken because of the dog still terrifies me. As I've mentioned in my previous post before, my family has had some remote land up in the mountains outside of Eureka. I come down here a few times every year and haven't really experienced anything too out of the ordinary. But last night was different. Different to say the least. I didn't know this before, but apparently this area is pretty popular for UFO sightings. I still don't know if that's what this was, but I'm having a very hard time to come up with a logical explanation. We had a good fire going for a few hours, and after everyone else went to bed, it was just my dad, my fiance and I left. So we're all gathered round there, just talking, even about constellations. So we all leaned back and were staring up at the sky. My fiance then pointed out a light that was noticeably brighter than the stars. It was steadily moving. Immediately I figured it as a satellite, but my dad chimed up with, "I don't think it is. Watch it for a second." My dad and I are hugely into aliens, and both have had a fair amount of sightings in the past. I focused closer on the light, and saw it wasn't just gliding across in a straight line, it was zigzagging, back and forth, moving eastwards. Three of us are explaining about how weird it was when suddenly it screeched towards the southern mountains. I'm thinking to myself, okay, is this actually happening? The light just stopped suddenly, hovering above the mountain for at least 5 minutes. At this point, we're all saying it's definitely not a satellite, with the occasional comment like, wow, this is wild. The light started to shift again to the right until it was behind a tree, and we lose sight of it completely. We went back to the normal campfire for a couple of minutes, and my fiance gets some drinks. As soon as he got up, the entire sky lit up in an almost painfully bright white flash, like lighting on steroids. This was a crystal clear night. There wasn't a storm on the radar for miles and miles. We couldn't even see one little wispy cloud. It could not have been lighting. My dad and I are the only ones who saw it, as most people were asleep and my fiance's inside. There wasn't a single sound when it happened, no boom or rumble, but the entire mountain went dead silent for a few minutes after. I mean, honestly, it's just so eerie. It's like time around us paused momentarily, and my dad ended up feeling so uncomfortable and anxious that he just went to bed. The two of us stayed up for a while after, but we didn't see anything weird or any flashes, but we had a very heavy sense of unease afterwards. Back in October of 1989, my mum and I went up to the western part of Northern Carolina for a week to see the leaves change colour. We rented a cabin which was owned by the cousin of my brother's former high school band teacher who had retired several years earlier. The band director was more or less keeping watch over the place. Now, he actually lived down the street, but it wasn't until Friday afternoon that we saw him. The cabin was somewhat in the wilderness, but it was near a main road. The band director had to go away for the weekend and was letting us know. We had the name of the cousin in case we needed any help. This was on a Friday afternoon. Up until that time, the trip has been uneventful. Friday evening we went to a church dinner, which was down the road. When we came back home, it's already dark. My mum started thinking about, we're the only ones on this road, and we don't know where the nearest neighbour was, which is a little unsettling. The moon wasn't full, but there was light to the moon. We had separate rooms in the cabin. The power went out in the cabin shortly after we come back from the church dinner. Then my mother heard what sounded like footsteps, and she saw what looked like an outline of a hat. There was a man walking around near the cabin. Then we saw this hat disappear to the woods. By this time, both of us are terrified that this man is going to come into the cabin to hurt us. Both of us wondering if he had cut the power source. I decided to sleep in bed, which is near my mum's room. We tried to sleep, but then were awoken by an owl howling. My mum could see the owl's eyes, which were looking into the window. The drake couldn't be closed entirely. The owl didn't take its eyes off my mum the entire night. The owl also hooted all night. My mum tried to ignore the owl, but its presence really unnerved her, and this unnerved me. Neither of us could sleep at every noise that jarred us. It would be like, what's that? What noise is that? And every once in a while we would see the outline of the hat walking around the general area. Then it'd go off into the woods. Both of us are freaked out at this point, but we weren't about to leave in the middle of night. There was no phone in the cabin, and this is long before cell phones were in common usage. The power did finally come back on several hours later, or seemed to. Now originally we were gonna leave on the Sunday, but as soon as the sun came up on Saturday, we left. A couple of days later my mum got a call from the band director. Apparently the man we saw was a mountain man who was very weird and done weird things around other cabins and is known in the area. This happened to my FIL probably 10 years ago in a hunting cabin in Alabama. It popped into my head as we're heading out there tomorrow for a few days of deer hunting. He told me to go ahead and share the story. It's short, but as I get a little creeped out in the woods, this would have freaked me out. So, as many people probably know, we get out an hour or so before light and climb into a tree, into a stand, usually fairly deep into the hunt. Now on this morning, my FIL has been in his stand for a couple hours, and it was getting light and he was reading a book as he wanted to wait for something to happen. Out of the fog, he heard a woman's voice much closer than anyone should have been to him at that time. She's calling Hunter, oh Hunter, in a very singy voice, like a mother calling to her child. Now as I said, we're pretty deep in the woods. There are sticks and dried leaves everywhere. You generally make a pretty good racket getting to your stand, which is why we get out so early. Not only that, but in order to know where he was and spot him in the camouflage tree, she must have seen his light when he walked out and followed him into the woods and waited hours before calling him. His first thought was that the woman was calling someone named Hunter, maybe her son. She called again and realizes that he is a hunter. She turns around, peers around the trees and sees a young woman. She, in very few words and in halting speech, explains that something's wrong with her hot water heater and wants to know if he can come and look. Now the strangeness of the situation hasn't set in yet, and he's a give the shirt off his back kind of guy. Not to mention he's nearly 6'2", 300 pounds with a gun. So he wasn't too worried about this small woman and starts getting down to have a look. He follows her back to her mobile home, which borders our hunting land, probably about 10 minutes away. She walks inside, leaving the door open. He is trailing behind a little, so as he gets to the door, kind of knocks and sticks his head in to say hello. There's no answer. When he entered the laundry room, he can see there is a hot water heater and it's just pouring out of the bottom. Just absolutely pouring, I mean. He walks over and turns a valve off and says hello again, but hears nothing. The house is empty. Empty of people anyway. A disaster is inside though. At this point, he's starting to see how strange it is, and decides that this is just a kind of situation where you get robbed then murdered and nopes out of there. Now, we have hunted this land for years since and have never seen anyone at this place. Every time I pass her place, it sends chills up my spine. I don't know if she was a ghost or something, but this was definitely some kind of setup, and I'm glad that we all got out of there okay. Had we been weaker, smaller targets, I'm sure the whole situation would have gone a lot differently. I went hiking with my boyfriend and a few of his friends. The 5 of us were heading up a not so popular mountain trail that's about 10 minutes long up to a small lake. We saw 2 couples on their way down, but no one had passed us on our way up. Now the trail isn't super easy, and wildlife is pretty common. We see a moose about 3 miles in, so we're all on guard for more moose or a mountain lion or anything that can cause a problem. After the moose, we ran into a small patch of snow that's maybe 100 feet along the trail. Past the snow, we walk about another 20 to 30 yards and find a deer's rib cage and spine. We gathered around it not saying much, and one of the guys turns it over with a stick. It was picked totally clean. After we stand up, an older guy is standing like 10 feet away from us just staring. Not one of us heard or saw him walk up. It was like he just appeared. After we make eye contact, he just turns around, jumps over the little creek, cutting through 18 inches of snow, then walking up the side of the mountain to disappear. I'm a park ranger, and even when I'm off duty, I absolutely love to go camping. Now, this is something that had never changed and has been something I've really done for a long time. I used to go with one of my best friends, but we kind of become distant after he moved for college and I did, so often I'd end up going tenting alone and camping. Now, there was one particular trip that I went on that seemed perfectly normal. Now, I had to drive a good 3 or 4 hours to actually get to here, so it is a relatively long trip, I guess. At the time, my car didn't have a working radio, so it was relatively annoying. I mean, I could get it to work sometimes, but I'd literally have to hit the side until it come to life. Now, I didn't set off too late. I actually set off relatively early in the morning, and the drive up there was beautiful. I'd love to say I had music playing, but like I said, I didn't have any of that, so I just had the windows down, using the air to help keep me wake up. It's a technique I've deployed before when I felt extra tired. I drank all my coffee too, so I didn't have much else I could do. Now, when I start doing this, I realised that an absolutely massive bug has come into my truck, and I actually almost crashed into some trees just because it made me jump. This thing come a couple of inches from my face, and I promise you it was the last thing I expected. Luckily, I managed to swipe it out of the window and end up doing up all the windows again. Now, on my drive, the sun's just starting to rise and it's really beautiful. It's actually a little bit blinding really, and I have to put on my sunglasses and put down the thing on top that kind of covers the light. I don't know what it's called, but you know what I mean, where you can sort of store papers and stuff. I was actually quite hesitant to get this thing down on my truck because I was 100% convinced that a massive creature was going to come out like had come in the window earlier, but luckily nothing was there. So I continue on my drive, and I do realise that there's another truck behind me, not too far off. I haven't noticed it before, but something about it just seems a little weird. Originally, I think it's actually one of my friends who has a similar one, but I realise this is different. Also, all of the windows are really tinted out. In fact, I don't think it was legal how tinted these windows were, but hey, I'm not an officer, I'm just going here to enjoy my trip. Now, my new friend of mine followed me for a good hour, and I do think it's pretty odd. I would every so often see another car or truck going past, but not that often, and especially none that were following me. I decided that I was going to park off at the side of the road to use the toilet. Now, I'm a little bit embarrassed to admit that, but I was relatively desperate and the coffee had kind of got to me, and I drank a lot before, so I pull over quickly. I'm so desperate that I forget about the truck behind me and I run off into the woods. It's funny because I probably look like a madman, but hey, I was desperate. I'd gone quite far because I really didn't want anyone to see me, and I knew if anyone recognised me as being a ranger, I'd probably get in a lot of trouble for it. It's extremely unlikely, but it's just something that ran through my mind. So I ran off and alleviate myself. Just as I finished, there's a massive spider just next to my foot. I jump back and kind of kick some leaves in its direction and it scurries off. Thank God that thing didn't go up me when I was using the toilet, I think to myself, and kind of laugh. I then hurry back to my truck because I'm getting a little bit cold because the trees are actually blocking out some of the sunlight. I quickly adjust my rear view mirror to make sure I can see good when I'm driving, and I notice the truck has stopped again. It stopped just out of sight, but this is weird because it's been with me for at least an hour. Maybe they assumed it was a rest stop? I don't know. Pretty unrealistic. I decide I should start driving forward and just keep an eye on it. I'm glad to say that it eventually goes out of sight, and I continue on, and I quickly forget about the truck. Now, there's a good chance that maybe they just decided that they were going to stop in the same place as me, and presumed that was what you're allowed to do here. But I'm not so sure, to be honest. Something about it just seemed really off and odd. But anyway, I was happy that there was no weird bugs or insects around me at this point, and I continue on my way. And that's the most important thing for me now. I continue driving, and I still have a couple of hours left now. It's not too much further, but I was starting to get a bit bored, not having the radio on. I think maybe that was making me a little bit overcautious and overthinking everything, because when there's nothing there to distract you, I guess your mind can kind of run wild and get away from you. I continue, and I eventually make it to the area that I love to go camping. Lucky enough for me, when I pull up I don't see another car in sight, which is absolutely gorgeous for me. I'm someone who likes being around people, but I suppose where I have to do it relatively often for my job, I appreciate having uninterrupted time within nature. Now, the area where I park my car is far away from a big flooded area. Well, it's not really flooded, it's from rainfall, but I do not want to fall in this because I know if I get wet out here, I'm going to have a nightmare trying to dry off my clothes, and I don't really have enough to not be in trouble if that happens. Quickly grab everything from out my truck and I make my way through the gate. I then continue and make my way over to the main path. There's some areas that I've camped in before around here, but I want to get away from people, so I decide to continue on. I had some really nice boots with me that I'd bought. They weren't ones I used while I was on the job, they're just ones that I found really comfortable. They're very lightweight too. I'm actually trying my best not to get them dirty, which is something I'm quite embarrassed to admit, because I know if some of my ranger friends had heard me admit that, they would probably give me endless grief for it, but I really like my shoes and wanted to keep them tidy. I have some camouflage pattern on too, which is something I always liked to wear when I went out into the woods. It sounds stupid, but I like the idea of being able to hide from animals and things if I really need it, but of course you're always going to get ones that can just smell you, but hey, it made me feel a little bit better. Now no, I didn't have a camouflage matching tent too, which would be really funny if I did, but I kind of wish I did, but I'll get to that later. Now I eventually make it to my camping spot, and I quickly get a fire going. I decide that I'm going to cook some food, and I want to collect as much firewood as I can so I don't have to do it in the following morning. Now everything's normal, and I actually really enjoyed the first night. I remembered laying back on my sleeping bag, which I had just poking out of the tent. I was staring up at the stars, and for the first time in my life I saw a shooting star, which I thought was really cool. I jokingly made a wish to myself that I'd make it out of there in one piece, which I actually thought was really funny at the time. With my head rested on the side, I can hear some kind of rustling off in the trees around me. Now I'm a little bit worried that it's some kind of animal, but I stop for a moment just to try and figure out what this is. The fire's gone out at that point, so I'm pretty sure they can't see me, unless it's just some of the burning embers that are going strong still from my fire. Now I'm almost certain I can make out the sound of somebody calling out for help. What's really weird is it sounds like my brother. I know that's impossible though, because he's about 5 states over, and I'm certain he's not here with me. I think maybe it's some form of delirium and my mind playing tricks on me, and I decide that I should probably get some sleep, and I needed the rest. I guess I'm kind of freaked out from what happened earlier still and haven't realised it, and maybe my mind's just playing tricks on me. I really need the sleep. I get into the tent and I try and convince myself that this is an owl. But every so often I just faintly hear it, almost like it's perfectly in place for me to hear my brother calling out for help just as I'm about to sleep. Yeah, that's it. It must be my mind, I tell myself. You're half fading in and out of consciousness, just get some rest. I eventually managed to sleep. I wake up the next day and I feel absolutely terrible. I have a really bad headache and I really struggled to get out of bed. I start to question whether it was something I've eaten or drinking, but everything seems to be fine. I actually go and smell my food to make sure that it's not gone off, but everything's fine. I think this is quite bizarre and I think, oh, maybe I'm a bit unwell and I should probably head back soon. I decide the best thing to do now is not to pay too much attention to it and just to head on. I think if I'm really unwell, I can always head back sooner, and I'm happy to do so. I then start on my journey once again. Now, for this part of my trip, I'm going to do some fishing, which is something I love, so I'm quite excited for this. I have all my bait and everything with me and a fishing rod, so I head off. I make it over to the area that I like to do fishing in, and I cast my reel. I fumbly knocked over my bait, and I'm quite annoyed because all of the little maggots and things are now swimming in the water, and I'm not going to be able to get them back easily. I could say, I guess it's no fishing now. I ended up waiting for a good few hours, but unfortunately, there was no fish for me to catch that day. I jokingly say, well, you're going to enjoy this food I've left there for your fish. I then turn to leave and start gathering up my stuff, and I can hear somebody scream, "No you're not," just off in the distance, just out of earshot. I pause for a moment. I'm convinced the fish aren't talking to me, but I'm not certain now. Maybe I'm really unwell and I'm starting to hallucinate and imagine things that aren't actually there. I then laugh and say, say it again. I didn't realise anyone else was here, and I'm met with complete silence. Now I think this is extremely odd because I clear as day heard somebody respond to what I just said, but the thing that really gets to me is the distance. I didn't say my part very loud, but they said theirs very far away, so how could they have possibly heard me? It doesn't make sense. I go to turn around, and I can faintly see the embers from a fire just off in the distance, with another not too far off to the side of me. I realise maybe I've intruded upon someone else's site and decide to leave quickly. I don't want to mess with whoever's here, and they seem a little bit weird, I decide, and I head back to the camp. Now it was relatively dark when I started to head back, and I have a horrible feeling that something bad's about to happen, but being a ranger, I convince myself it's nothing and just to calm down and stop being silly. When I'm making my way back, however, there's something I realise that's just odd. I can still see the faint glow of embers near the water, but I don't smell any fire, and I definitely don't see any smoke. And surely if somebody was there recently, I would have realised that there would have been some sign. I was too scared, honestly, to investigate further at the time, but I know that I have to make it back to my campsite now to be within relative safety. I'm annoyed at myself for knocking over all the bait in the water too, and decide just to get home, make some nice food and call it a night in my tent. I go over there to do that, and I just put all my things down and everything seems to be back to normal as it was. But it isn't exactly. Some of my things have definitely been moved, and I'm actually seriously questioning whether I'm very unwell and haven't realised it. I mean, waking up and feeling terrible, knocking over the bait so clumsily, and not realising where my things are when I've returned. I've put all of this down to food poisoning, or something I've drank that I definitely shouldn't have, and that I need to cut the trip early. I say yeah, just make the trip early, and I decide just to tuck into some of my favourite food earlier than I was supposed to, because I know I'm going to be going back the next morning. Now I make it back into my tent, and I stayed up for what must have been 2 or 3 hours, trying to listen to make sure that there was nobody around me at the time. I can't hear anyone, and that's when I remembered it again. Why did I hear my brother calling out my name? I must be really unwell now, and I slowly start drifting in and out of consciousness, but somehow I'm just about able to keep myself awake when I hear it. Screams for help once again, this time closer. Now, it's not in my brother's voice this time. I don't actually recognize the voice, but it sounds very real. I wait for a few moments to try and listen, and I'm met with silence again. I really think that my mind's going now, but I know this was real. I decide to slowly unzip my tent, grabbing my knife. I took my head out of the tent cautiously, and I'm met once again with nothing. I'm now extremely annoyed because there's either someone in danger that I'm not helping, or I'm imagining all of it. And I decide that I have to investigate. I quickly put on my warmer clothes and head out. What's worse is, I don't really have much charge on my flashlight. I have to use it very sparingly and only in flashes, but the problem is my eyes aren't really adjusting to the darkness and I can't rely on my light source, so I have to keep this in mind. I decide I'm going to use a technique that we've been taught in Ranger School. I'm going to circle around the perimeter of my tent and make my way back again. I do have quite a good idea of my bearings, and I guess it's from being a ranger that really helped me out with that. So I head out in one direction and make my start. Now initially everything seems normal. I make it about 100 yards away from where my tent is, and I turn back and realise that I may have not put out the fire as well as I thought I had. I realise that I can still see a red glow coming from just off to the side of my tent. Just as I turn back to make sure I put it out correctly, it goes off suddenly. I think this is really bizarre, but I don't think much of it and continue my search. There's either somebody out here on drugs, or somebody who's really needing help and is in danger and might be injured. Maybe they've been out here for weeks, who knows, and I might be their only way to safety. I decide that I have to figure out what this is, and I continue the search. The thing is, I don't find anything, until suddenly, help, right next to me. I'm convinced it's a person now because it's at head height, and I turn around and I can see it's something just behind the tree. I think this is pretty weird because why can't I see this person? The tree is very small, but I can hear this. I can hear help once again. I then get closer to the tree and I realise that there's a speaker taped to the side of it. I think this is really weird. In my frustration of something scaring me so much, I ended up punching it and breaking it. I didn't hear the cry for help again. I think this is really odd, thinking maybe some stupid hunters put it out here, thinking it's going to attract some kind of weird God knows what, and I shouldn't have stumbled upon it. I decide that I should really get back and maybe get some sleep now. Now I'm absolutely exhausted by this point, and I know hiking back's an option, but it's gonna be virtually impossible because how far I have to go. I decide the best thing I can do at this point is pick up all of my belongings and set up camp somewhere else. So I go back to my tent. I'm very cautious to make sure no one else is around me, and I gather my things. It takes me a good 20 minutes to put everything away, and the whole time I have my knife in my pocket where I can very easily grab it and get anyone if I need to. Now I try and act very confident, portraying the fact that I'm not scared, but really I feel terrified. The weirdest thing is I'm not convinced whether this is anybody actually out here or not at this point. I'm pretty certain it's my mind playing tricks on me because of something I've eaten or drank, so I'm not too worried if that makes sense. I get all of my things together and I head off. I only go for about 20 minutes or so because I'm not really sure what direction I'm heading in. Once finding a really good spot, I set my tent up and settle in for the night, and I must have passed out. I wake up in a dream where everything's a very warm colour and it seems to be daylight. It's almost like just as the sun has started to come up and everything's very beautiful and you feel very warm. I realise it must be daylight now and I force myself to wake up. I go to touch part of my tent and it's extremely warm. I think this is odd, but luckily I can get out another way and I quickly do that. and I'm blinded. Literally, it's like staring at the sun for a second and I turn around, and suddenly I smell smoke. Now my brain suddenly kicks to life. Something's off here. I quickly worm my way out of the tent, and I realise now that it's not daylight, it's nightfall, it's still the same night, and my tent is on fire, and some of my belongings around me. I look, and everything I own virtually is on fire, and my tent is starting to collapse. I think this is a dream, and I wipe my eyes frantically, but it isn't. I reach down for my knife quickly. I scream out, "Hey, who is this, and what are you doing to me?" Still not entirely sure if it was an accident or not, but then I realise there's no fire here. I left my original campsite. I realise now that something has set fire to my tent while I was sleeping, and if I hadn't have woke up when I did, I wouldn't be here now. I would be literally starting to set on fire, slowly trapped in my tent. I want to say I was brave, and I wait to find whoever this sick person or whatever this thing was to get them with the knife, but I wasn't. I ran for my life. I turn around quickly and continue in the direction that I would have went if I continued hiking for a good spot. I didn't care where I was going, I just had to get out of here. I can't hear anything else behind me, luckily. Just the sounds of the fire behind me. The thing that's worse is the fire is actually spreading now, and I'm quite worried there's going to be a big forest fire. There's enough dry leaves to set up half of this place, but that's a later issue. I continue going, constantly glancing back, and realising that I must have covered some distance because the fire is getting more and more distant from my view. Eventually I've slowed down a bit and just start climbing up a hill. I take one last look back at the campsite, the last I'll ever see of my tent, and I can just about make out a figure next to the fire, standing there, certainly staring in my direction. That was more than enough for me to know that this wasn't just in my mind, this was all very real and it wasn't an accident that I caused. I turn round and I hike for another good 40 minutes in the cold night air, with the moonlight as my only guidance. Being a ranger, I have a very good idea of where I'm going, luckily, and I managed to make it back to an area that I know quite well. I loop round back onto the small path that's going to lead me back to my car. This is when I break out into a sprint again when I can see my truck. I quickly get in and, almost on autopilot, get it into reverse. Now my adrenaline must have been going really strong because I actually can't remember turning the keys to the ignition, just the engine coming to life. Again, I don't remember driving down the road, but I drove for another 45 minutes until I make it to a local town. I immediately pull over into a bar because it's one of the only places that is still open now. I walk in and demand to use the phone. I don't even explain what's happened. They must have been able to see that something was wrong because they handed me the phone without asking anything. I quickly called the fire department and alert them that there might be a forest fire, and then I called the police and explained what's happened, and I also called into the ranger station that I worked at just to explain that I wouldn't be coming into work for the next few days because something that happened. Now at first they thought I was drunk because there's music in the background, but something about my tone told them otherwise. I was eventually able to meet up with the police a few minutes later and explain exactly what happened. They told me that they were going to send out a squad to investigate. A few moments later, I heard a fire truck screaming past too. Someone offered me a beer, but I declined because I wanted to make sure I was 100% sure of what had happened as I made the police report. I went over to the truck and explained everything that happened and said, "Can I please just sleep now? I don't want to investigate this. I don't want to know anything else," and they gave me their number so I can call back the following day. Nicely, they even offered to drive me over to a local motel where they paid for me to spend the night, which I greatly appreciated. I made it into bed and completely passed out and woke up 12 hours later. This time I wasn't in danger, and the light I could see around me was real, and I felt completely safe this time, and thank God for that. I called back the number again, and the police informed me that they're still doing a continuing investigation, and they can only tell me what they found from that first night. They said they had a good search, and thankfully there was no big fire. It had already gone out by the time they got there, but there was still a good 50 or so square meters of scorched earth. They looked as hard as they possibly could for any signs of life or people out there that could have caused this, but all they found was a burnt out tape recorder just next to a tree that was burnt down. I then explained that I had actually heard voices on the tape recorder, and they said thank you for the information, but of course this was completely burnt now and virtually useless for their case. I'm still waiting for updates, but I'll let your imagination figure out what happened. I'm convinced, absolutely convinced, that somebody was hunting me and was looking for a murder victim that day, and they'd been stalking me from the truck, probably looking for someone they thought was innocent and an easy target to get out in the woods, but they probably didn't realize they were messing with a ranger, someone who knew that wilderness very well, and was able to use techniques to stay completely calm even though everything around them was going wrong. Now, I've been sitting on this story for many years now, and it might not be as creepy as some of them on here, but it's really creepy to me. Now, my aunt owned a large piece of land, literally over 100 acres in northwest Connecticut for many years now. Her property is located in a state park that is mostly uninhabited and only frequented by backpackers. Her land is well off any main roads, and you have to drive through quite a lot of forest to reach her home. She bought the land and remodeled the old house that was already built on it, so it was more livable. And going up to visit her has always been my favourite thing to do. I've been going very early since I was actually a baby and spent countless hours exploring the woods, creeks and land around the house. We'll call it the farm, although it's not really a true one, as there's not any agriculture or livestock there. My auntie does have some rescued miniature horses, alpacas, donkeys, and other animals like ducks. Well, back in the day, really. Now, the animals are on par with some of the best protected in the area, and they're very happy and have a great life there. They're actually quite chubby, really. Now, the rest of the farm is untouched woodlands. In the early 2000s, she decided to install a 12-feet fencing around the property, although it only encloses about 80 acres of land she owns. She explained to me that she couldn't stand the sound of the coyotes howling right outside her window at night, and that she had some creepy encounters while living out here. She did not go into details of these since I was a young child. She lives alone though, so I understand why she wanted a sense of security living so deep in the woods. We are originally from the Bayous of Louisiana, so being in this type of environment was new to all of us. Anyway, despite being initially unfamiliar with the land, I eventually learned to navigate the area very well as a child. I had a few favourite spots, and one was up a small foothill in the deepest part of the woods. I would go up every so often that eventually a small path was established in the brush, and I would bring my cousins with me to show them my little oasis. Now, this is in 2008 when I was about 10 years old. I took a summer trip to my aunt's and brought my best friend Alex with me. She and I often took trips here together during our childhood, and this was not her first time accompanying me to the farm. I remembered that we were in the woods at my favourite spot, sitting together, listening to Katy Perry playing Doodle Jump on our new iPad touches. This makes me laugh, but we were just trying to enjoy some nature while getting a feel of our new tech, I guess. We were there for a while, enjoying ourselves and talking about random kid stuff, when there was a shift in the air, almost like a suffocating stillness and silence settling upon the woods. I paused the music and looked to Alex, who was already staring at me with a concerned expression on her face. We stayed still and silent for a minute, tilting our heads to listen to the woods and search out any unfamiliar sounds that normally would bellow out throughout the farm and night, but there were no birds, no summer bugs, and the trees almost seemed to be frozen in place. As if it was like winds that would usually rustle amongst us was completely vacant. It was a horrible, vulnerable feeling that Alex could feel too. Then began the sound of footsteps coming from even deeper in the woods. It took a moment for me to determine what the sound is, but the distinct rhythm of weight being picked up and down on the leaves is impossible not to realize. It was very heavy sounding and was coming up towards us from a steep slope down the side of the mountain and foothill. I remembered thinking it was impossible for a human to move so easily through that part of the woods since it was very thick, with fallen branches and trees, even making it hard for an agile, slim child to navigate. I mean, let alone an adult. It felt as though the woods laid still, and we're waiting for the footsteps to come even closer. "Do you hear that, Alex?" I whispered, and she nods. "It sounds like footsteps," I continue, and she nods again. Looking like she was about to burst into tears, I took her hand and began running down the makeshift path with her, trying not to fall apart or let her lag behind me. We did not stop until we reached the house. I don't think we told anyone that day because we were just too shaken up to even comprehend what might have been out there. The next day, I said to Alex if she would go back to the spot with me. She was very hesitant but eventually agreed and said we could go back to look for other signs of humans. We made our way back, nervous but determined to discover what had invaded our little sanctuary. We reached the spot. I looked down towards the direction that we heard the footsteps. I think that I even slid down a bit to investigate the plausible indentations in the brush and leaves. Now initially I can't really see anything there. I didn't go too far because I was about to lose my nerve, and I hadn't noticed much anyway, so I decided to climb back up to where Alex was waiting for me very nervously. We decided that it must have been some kind of animal or deer, despite every logical explanation indicating otherwise. I knew what deer sounded like, and that wasn't a deer, but I wanted to forget and just have fun again. We took out our iPods and began the same ritual of relaxing and playing games while chatting about nonsense. It seemed like everything went back to normal really, or relatively. So we quickly forgot about the terrifying experience and let our native childlike wonder take over. After a little while, the stillness returned. It happened so quickly that we almost forgot about what happened before. However, this time, the footsteps started almost instantly, seeming like it was a moment we forgot about them before. Now, this was really weird because maybe if it was an isolated event, we couldn't have questioned it too much, but now we're absolutely certain that this was real. Now, the best way I can explain the sound and the location is similar to a spot that we went to the day before, but somewhat more to the right of where the forest was, and it's very dark, and the incline to reach us is less steep. I didn't wait too long to run, but it was long enough to realize that the sound was fast and closer, definitely not a deer or bear. I did not look into the woods too closely because I wanted to get the hell out of there, and I was scared to see whatever it was. I knew it was close enough that it would be upon us at any moment if we didn't flee. So without a word, Alex and I took off and ran as fast as humanly possible out of the woods. It is not a super exciting experience, but really bizarre. I've actually since moved out, but I've never been able to forget this experience. I seriously don't have a clue what this possibly could have been. I doubt it was a person, so I'm really not sure what this was. A few years ago, my friend Tez and I set out on the Great American Road Trip. We were going to drive from New York to LA, zigzagging through the country for 6 weeks. Now we're both in our early 20s and pretty broke, and my mum had a long haul truck and suggested that I saved a ton of money and we could actually sleep in the back of the hatchback. Now, it was pretty cozy as a setup. We brought some blankets and sheets at Goodwill and cut one of them up to make curtains. Now, by the end of the week, we gotten so ready that we can really set up a camp in about 10 minutes. I mean, luggage moved out to the front, curtains up, bedding down and ready for the night. Now, we slept in parking lots, free campsites, rest areas, basically anywhere it seemed safe and semi-legal. There was never a night after the first night where we felt scared until the last week of the trip in Arizona. We were near Flagstaff and we had gotten pretty used to our routine. We didn't go on a set schedule and would never drive more than a few hours. No destination really in mind, outside a few must-see landmarks. We'd drive to places we found the night before on Google and take suggestions from other campers, locals, and people we'd met. We'd also gotten very good at making friends. We went to Denny's with a group of rednecks we met at a campsite in the back of their pickup because I got hungry and overheard them saying that they were going to go. We met an 80-year-old cowboy who took us out drinking and taught us how to line dance at a country bar. Now, we played the guitar with some musicians in the middle of a thunderstorm, got fed up really and decided that we're going to go hang out with some other people we met. We spent the 4th of July with a family who basically adopted us into their campsite. Basically, every encounter we had with a stranger was really a positive one. This night didn't appear to be any different. We found a free campsite on Google and drove into the woods, following our GPS. We were pretty far out of town and something seemed a little off when we pulled up to the campsite. There was one RV parked and 2 cars further up in the trees. We pulled up near the RV and a man opened the door who said hello, and he just stared. Now his expression was completely blank. Then, as if she hadn't said anything, he just slowly closed the window again and stared at us the entire time. Figuring out that he wants some privacy and maybe we're being obnoxious, we pulled further down the road and found a flat spot to park the car. Instead of our usual routine of setting up camp immediately while it was still light out, we goofed around for a while and just had fun. Now my friend pointed out a campfire further down the campsite and we decided to go and be friendly. We'd met so many cool people from the previous few weeks that we actually wanted to go and chat and wander over. Now near the campfire were 2 men, the owners of the car we'd seen earlier. They seemed friendly and sat down to chat. They were drinking and smoking and we sat down and had a beer with them. One of the men seemed really off, and we came out feeling that something was completely off and that maybe 2 of the men didn't actually know each other and the older man was definitely on some kind of drugs. He was spinning in circles and talking about UFOs. However, he seemed harmless. This left us chatting with the younger man, who kept claiming to be a former park ranger. He was handsome and easygoing and spent several hours just chatting about our trip, everything, and then started talking about the bear. He'd seen a bear earlier in the forest. Now we don't really believe him, and he pulls out his camera to show photos of it. It was very close to the campsite, and we're both a bit freaked out. It wasn't unheard of for one of us to get up to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, so the idea of a bear being there scared us. Now as we said that, the ranger laughed and his expression changes. It's hard to describe, but his voice seemed somehow cold. He said, "If you get out of your car in the middle of the night, it's not the bears you need to be scared of." I kept waiting for the laugh, but it never come. I laughed awkwardly and made a dumb joke about serial killers in the woods, and my friend laughed as well and joked about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. We moved on to another subject, but within 5 minutes the ranger who come back to it and was talking about something grabbing us out from the middle of the night in the car. No matter how we steered the conversation away from serial killers, he kept latching on. The older man was high as a kite at this point and was staring at the stars and not talking. We'd just awkwardly laugh or sip our beer and tried to get the conversation elsewhere. Then the ranger stood up and walked towards the cooler to get another beer. At this point it's pitch black out. I can't see anything outside of the circle of light from the campfire. The beer cooler was outside of that circle. Suddenly, there's a red dot in the darkness, and it took a moment for me to realise that it's a camera. The ranger's holding a camera. He's taken a photo of us. I could see the screen on the digital camera light up. Now, it wasn't odd for people that we've met to take pictures with us. My friend is gorgeous with dark hair, blue eyes, like a young Megan Fox, and we're friendly. People like having pictures of themselves too. But it was an entirely strange thing to have this person taking photos of us without asking, or even any indication of what was about to happen. We were both staring at him like deer in headlights at this point, but instead of realizing what he's doing is weird, he suddenly checks his camera, adjusts some things, and takes another, with no flash, no asking us to smile or anything, and no explanation. At this point, he comes back and sits down with us, not saying a word about the photo. At this point, me and my friend are very freaked out. We make some rubbish excuses that we need to set up our campsite and nope the hell out of there. When we both start to leave, the UFO guy smiles and says have a good night. Ranger, however, looks at us with a smile that doesn't reach his eyes and says, "Be careful out there. There's more than bears in the woods." Now at this point, every hair on my body stood on end. I wasn't alone in my discomfort either, because my friend laughed a response and pulled away with me quickly towards the car. We rushed back to the car, which we only found in the dark by referencing the RV, and jump in the front seat, so my friend is almost hyperventilating. Why did he take a picture of us? I read that serial killers sometimes warn their victims. She stared at me for a second and locks the car doors. Do you think he just took pictures of us? Now we're both really freaked out and she's in complete panic and quickly turns on the headlights. I immediately yell at her to turn them off because he's gonna know exactly where our car is. God knows why, but this is the only night that we'd not set up our camp. We didn't need to tear anything down, so we just get in the car and floor it out of there. And as we got onto the dirt road, the ranger was walking towards our car with that same expression. I hope I never see him again. I had a really weird experience in the Conakry National Park outside of Colombia last winter that brought me to this sub. Now I live in Colombia SC and frequented CMP, so I'm familiar with the area. I often jump the fence and walk the boardwalk at night. It's very peaceful to walk the swamp and hear all the wildlife. Now, they never have a ranger or guard here after hours, so I always go alone. The last time I did this was in October 21. I was taking my usual stroll with the flashlight in hand. I should mention again that between the insects and frogs, the sound is loud, but then it completely stopped when I was about a mile in. I heard what I thought was my wife call me from the trail ahead, but she wasn't there. I was alone and she was out of town. I then heard water sloshing to my right and saw nothing with my flashlight. I chalked it up as being tired and kept it moving. The wildlife started up shortly thereafter, and everything was fine. Maybe 15 minutes later, I noticed that it got eerily quiet again, and I heard the swamp water slosh in to my left. This time, however, it was more deliberate, like somebody walking almost. I was in a thick proportion, and I couldn't see more than 20 feet in front of me, and then I heard my wife's voice again. Again, she wasn't with me and was out of town. Certainly moving through a swamp at 1 AM was not an option for her. I saw what looked to be a human silhouette for a split second, but it was off, very pale and skinny, and taller than me at 6 feet. I noped out of there and ran almost the entire 2 miles back to the truck, and didn't slow down again until I could hear wildlife once more. Like I said, this boardwalk is just in the swamps. Nobody's walking around the water at night without a light, or even, I don't know, any kind of animal that big shouldn't really be there. I feel that I should add that I wasn't necessarily in sleep deprived mode, and I wasn't high or anything. I just liked the woods at night. I was so freaked by this that I had to share my story. I'm really convinced that what I encountered that day was actually a skinwalker or wendigo, or something that can actually mimic voices. There's no way some meth head was stumbling through the forest and swamps miles from civilization and sounds exactly like my wife. My girlfriend at the time and I went camping 5 hours away from her birthday/our anniversary. We made the trip the day after a big storm passed through. We left town early and got there in the early afternoon. The guy at the entrance of the campgrounds mentioned there was no one else there, and we're like, oh, this is going to be sick. First we drove down these long pathways to get to our designated spot. As you got closer to it, the long road narrowed, so basically you had to back out to get out. We unloaded the car, got the tent set up, and decided to go walk around the woods. It was dead silent, but it was still bright out, so we all took in the nature and walked a few miles away. We reached this point in the woods where there were some weird looking white cabins. They're very uniform, all built exactly the same way, like I guess they were a part of a camping grounds, but they seemed way out of the way and there was no signs of life there. I felt eerie really to look at it, like we shouldn't be there. So we turned around and walked back. We took a breath and just relaxed for a while and stare at the fire pit. Unfortunately, neither of us have been camping before, so we don't know how to start a fire. But luckily, we have some of those self-lighting logs from Walmart. I didn't know they existed, that's really cool. And some lighter fluid. But everything else around us was soaked to the bone from the rain that had passed the day before. We knew we needed some kind of kindling, but any dry sticks were few and far between, and nowhere to be found. Eventually, we got a small fire going and ate hot dogs and marshmallows and spent some time stargazing. Then we noticed how dark it was. My girlfriend was easily spooked and was like, "Can we get into the tent now?" So we put out the fire and crawled into the tent. We're talking to each other, but I could tell she was tense. And suddenly she goes, "Shh, do you hear that?" Before I could respond, I hear what appears to be footsteps, like heavy ones, and a group of people walking. I whisper to her, "It's probably animals," but she says, "No, it can't be animals. What animal sounds like that?" We then sat and stared at each other in the dark for what felt like an eternity, and we hear mumbling that gets loud along with the footsteps. Now it continues until it's right outside of our tent. We both froze. I don't think either of us were breathing, and then silence. We waited and waited, and I'm still not sure how much time actually passed, and eventually my girlfriend said, "We have to get to your car." The adrenaline was pumping now, so I peeled out of the tent into the darkness and told her to stay behind. We then literally ran into the car. I locked the doors and she was like, "What was that? We can't stay here. They said no one was out here but us. What was that?" I kept looking around for signs of life, but there was seemingly none. I looked at her and said, "Okay, I'm gonna grab our stuff, you stay here." Now we only have our ice chest and our tent out. I hopped out, ran, grabbed everything, tossing it into the back seat. I'm just about to go for the tent and I hear footsteps closing in. In absolute terror, I yanked the tent out of the ground, wrapped the tarp around it and slang it over my shoulder like some panicked Santa Claus and shoved it into the trunk. I didn't say anything when I got into the car and said, "Do we have everything in here?" And my girlfriend said yeah and floored it in reverse. Then we came to a fork in the road that went in like 6 different directions. I asked my girlfriend if she remembered what path we come down to get here, and she told me she didn't know. We chose a random one and ended up in a different camping spot. I cursed under my breath and slammed it into reverse again. Then I noticed from the angle that we exited that I could see the main path back to the gate, thanks to a small tie-in behind an overgrown bush. As we hightailed it out of there, I noticed there was a single small green light out in the woods near where our tent was. We drove the entire 5 hours back to our hometown and fell asleep on my girlfriend's parents' couch at 4 AM. We never spoke about the trip again, and I haven't desired to camp since, as you could imagine. Last summer, a good friend and I embarked on a backpacking trip through the White Mountain National Forest in New Hampshire. As fairly experienced day hikers, we felt comfortable in the Whites with our inaugural overnight trip. While planning, my buddy Ellis figured we could hike to a backcountry campsite to make our first wilderness night a little more fun. I wasn't going to disagree. Beautiful views, historic trails, and protected night in the Dry River wilderness. I was stoked, to say the least. Before any hiking trip I do, a little internet search on the trails or shelters I'll be coming across. Throughout the mid-1900s, there were a series of these lean-to ups, and down the Dry River wilderness meant for backpackers or through hikers really looking to escape the crowds in more populated areas of the forest. Though as time went on, the Forest Service had other more pressing matters. Many of these shelters were dismantled, except Dry River Shelter 3, the last remaining shelter in the wilderness. On the morning of our hike, I met Ellis at the trail at the head and we set off. The sky was overcast, bringing with it a dense fog through the trees. The weather left us with nearly no visibility, so there went our stunning views. At least the trail consisted of prime, technical New England rock, scrambling alongside the river. Ellis and I made it up the presidential ridge, stopping by the lakes of clouds. The hut was filled with day hikers, backpackers, and through hikers all socializing together. We were even more rewarded with some sun and a brief glimpse of the Dry River Valley on the summit of Mount Monroe before the fog rolled back in. With dwindling views and a stiff wind, Ellis and I hustled below treeline, down to the river Shelter 3, our home for the night. Once we dropped off the ridge into the valley, we entered the wilderness zone where the rangers patrolled sparingly. Time to really be alone in the wild. As we trek into the wilderness, all signs of civilization disappeared and the trail was densely overgrown. Although it had been raining all week, there were no footprints in the mud either. At least we'd have some relaxing isolation, I guess. After about an hour or so of descending, Ellis spotted the lean-to just as our legs were asking for relief. I look up and there's this gorgeous old timber structure with a well-used fire pit alongside a cold mountain river. Pristine camping. As we settled in and explored the site, I found a small, bound notebook nestled into the corner of the structure. On the cover someone wrote, Dry River Shelter number 3. Out of curiosity, I opened it, but found nothing more than a lone man's name scribbled onto the first page and a date. Just your standard log camping log. Oddly though, the man signed the book the previous day. We saw no footprints or signs of human life or animal disturbances on the trail here at the shelter. Rain can wash away tracks, but not all signs of animal life. Something felt off to me. I showed it to Ellis, who found it curious but nothing more than the sign of a single man. He convinced me that he's probably a hiking veteran and a professional at LNT. I bought into Ellis's thoughts on the situation and my mind eases now. At the sunset, we started a roaring fire alongside the riverbank. Ellis commented on how quiet the location was. having not seen another soul beyond the chirp of birds since leaving Crawford Path. The silence is eerie, but we figure that it's just civilization that's desensitized us to the world that we're actually in now. The sun was setting, and we grew tired with darkness. Ellis took the lean-to, and I spent the night in my tent. Sleep came quickly after hiking 8 miles with 20 pounds on my back, but it doesn't last long. A brutally sharp snapping noise awoke in me. The only thing I could compare it to would be a 2x4 smashing into a tree. I think, oh god, a bear's come to search our food, and that's 50 yards away. But nothing out of the ordinary for New Hampshire. Sleep took over once again, and I remembered waking up to the sun rising over the peaks. How can you sleep with a bear there? I stumbled out of my tent to see Ellis also waking up slowly. As we made our morning oats and coffee, I wander around the site again to see if I can find the marks a bear's left. Instead, I noticed something odd. The small notebook is open. I swear I put it back where I found it. Closed and in the back corner of the shelter, not open on the floor. Hey, Ellis. Were you checking out this camp log last night? Nah, I passed out, man. It's not like there's anything to read anyway, he responded. You sure? I commented as I bent over to pick it up. The lone hiker's name was not so lonely now. At least 20 more names have filled the pages. The lone traveller, whose name was originally on the first page, could now be found several pages deep into the notebook. I tossed it to Ellis, whose face instantly dropped when he sees all of the names on it. Great. Now I know it's not just dehydration or delusion from the previous day. Dude, we must have seen that thing last night. There's no freaking way we missed all these names. How could we? This is when I began to tell Ellis about the snapping noise during the night. I received nothing other than instant denial. These sounds were not the results of some hooligans or backward crazies following us. Ellis was convinced. It wasn't a bear either. Ellis led us out of the site and we instantly made our way back. A year has passed since then, and I'm still not quite sure what happened on our night at the Dry River Shelter 3. The memory of seeing a single name written on the front page is so clear in my mind now, I could not have mistaken it in. Could I have made the noises? Obviously not. I was asleep and they're further away. Ellis was asleep too. I would have seen him. I don't like to think it was paranormal, but it really begs the question. All logical explanations have went out the window. And of course a bear didn't write in there. It just terrifies me thinking of it now. I'm a 17-year-old high school guy with a weak body. I live in a small town in the Philadelphians, and this town is surrounded by rice fields, with a highway going straight across it. Part of my usual weekend routine is to go jogging early in the morning. This is at some time around 5 AM. My usual jogging route is from my house, somewhere in the middle of town, to a small hill with a wonderful view of town in the morning. To reach my destination, I would have to jog on the side of the highway. From time to time, fog would appear on the highway, and once you're inside, you can only see 10 or 15 feet before it all goes white. So one Saturday, I decide to jog. I invite one of my friends, the same age as me, to join me, since he follows the same route anyway. We left home at 5 AM, proceed to the highway. As usual, a thick fog blanketed the highway. The cars that would pass by had their lights on, and there were several one-ways because of road repairs. As we enter the fog, we decide to jog along the side of the road, past a couple of roadworks, about 100 meters along each. Now all's well at this point. We're a bit exhausted, but otherwise fine. We barely encountered anyone else, and usually they're just fellow joggers. Then we come across another roadwork, and we saw this guy crouched down on the asphalt. He was wearing a dirty orange vest, and he had a similarly dirty hard hat on. We can't really see his face, but decide just to ignore it. He looks as though he's fidgeting with something in his hands, so we thought he was just holding a few tools or something. Also, there was no one there but us, me, my friend and that guy. The fog's thick as hell. My friend signalled to me to keep a distance from the guy and I followed him. When we get closer, we can hear him humming a strange tune under his breath, which in of itself isn't that weird, but boy, we were wrong. As we get closer, he starts acting erratically. He stopped for a moment as I passed him, then starts laughing. It wasn't a regular laugh, it sounded sinister and a little dry. It was really loud, so it began to freak me out. We didn't increase our speed at this point, as we think he's messing with us. But he doesn't stop. He just kept laughing and laughing, and we knew it was beyond a prank. I can't describe his laugh more than I just didn't trust it. We didn't look back. We were speeding up now, as we were starting to see the hill. I was gasping for air, but somehow I didn't let that stop me. I forced myself on, and my friend was doing the same. He was probably 50 meters behind us when I looked at him. He had stopped laughing, but now he was standing straight and staring at us. He called out to us in my language in an arranged tone. That's when adrenaline kicked in. I just ran and ran until we reached the hill. In hindsight, I don't know how I was able to push myself for so long. When we finally arrive at the top, we're exhausted and nearly collapse on a cement bench and stay there for over an hour. Like a breath of fresh air, my friend laughs in a comedic manner. We then walk towards home. I haven't ate yet, I was so hungry, and as we passed the road we saw the guy in. He's no longer there. The only people there are wearing construction outfits that are working on the traffic signals, but nowhere near the man. As I got home, I told my parents about it and they said it's probably a nut job looking for someone to rob, who's probably stole the outfit, and I never went jogging again in the fog after that. This happened a few years ago when I was mountain walking. We started as a large group, but after some time of everyone choosing their own pace, I ended up walking alone. I was walking downhill through a thick forest area when I slipped on an unsteppable part of the trail, falling fully. It hurt quite a lot. Before I could get up, I see a deer walking out of the trees to my left, standing in front of me. This is not natural, because deers usually avoid human contact. Something was really off about this deer. I didn't know what. Its eyes appeared lifeless, filled with uneasiness. Then it opened its mouth to show multiple rows of what appeared to be razor-sharp teeth, and let out an ear-shattering scream. It sounded like nothing I ever heard before. It shouldn't exist. I watch quite a lot of horror movies, and yet none have come close to the scream of this. It was so demonic. After that scream, it closed its jaws and walked away to the side of the woods. Now I've never told this story to anyone else before, but I'm sure what I saw was a Wendigo. It just horrifies me knowing that I saw this thing. For a second when it happened I thought maybe I've hit my head, but I had no head injuries whatsoever and I knew exactly how I landed. It almost put me off running in the woods entirely. When I was young, I worked as a backpacking guide in Western NC. My schedule dictated a full 8-day shift with 6 days off. During those 6 days to myself, my other co-workers and me would play in the woods. In the summer, you can't beat a mountain swimming hole. One of our favourite activities was called Paradise Falls, alternatively called Wolf Creek Falls. This is a cliff jumping spot with a huge swimming area, a tiny slot canyon and an inner pool. Most will venture just to do the small jump, even though it's the smallest and arguably least accessible. Even though the jump is almost 9 foot at most, you must do 10 minutes rock scaling to get there. We are all adventuring in and out from inside this tiny canyon, and you can't see the main pool. Well, we got to the jump and coaxed the first person off, a fellow guide who had never been to the spot before. She jumped successfully and swam into the main pool and beach area. Then she screamed. Because she was now out of sight, myself and another guide jumped in together and swam the short distance to her, with the others in tow. Of course we figured she was injured somehow. She was treading water and just staring wide-eyed at the riverbank. When I looked to the shore, there stood a man. He's massive, easily 6'7", and appears to have no hair on him, wearing beat-up overalls. Perhaps the most disturbing is that he had folds of skin all over his body. Imagine the Michelin Man, but this is on his face, arms and chest, everywhere with these weird layers. He's also armed with a shotgun, staring intently at us. He just stood there and watched as we grab anything important and speed out of there. He walked slowly back into the forest and we never saw him again. Around 8 to 10 years ago, I was at a lake way out in the woods on some land that my dad owned. I was alone aside from my dog, a terrier. I had only been fishing on the little pier in the southeast corner for about 10 minutes when I get an almost overwhelming feeling of being in danger, and then notice something or someone watching me from the tree line on the opposite side of the lake. I was a kid, but somehow keep composure. For some reason, I felt it important that whatever it was did not know I was aware of them. Anyway, it started moving slowly from tree to tree, near taking its eye off me, but never truly facing away from me. The lake's about 70 yards wide, so I can't really see details, but I know where they're facing. After realizing that it was following me, I pull my pole down and walk down the pier and up the bank towards the trail back of our cabin, which is about 1/4 of a mile away. Once I hit the tree line, I bolted to the cabin and waited there with one of my dad's guns until my parents got home. The only witness I had was my dog, and he saw it as well. I know because when he saw the figure, he instantly starts growling in a low tone until I make him stop. I have no idea who or what it could have been or what the intentions are, but they're most certainly not good. This took place in southeast Mississippi near the Alabama border back in the 90s. We didn't live there, but we spent most weekends up there. I know it couldn't have been a normal person, because our nearest neighbour was a very old couple who literally lived miles away. Aside from the lake area that our cabin's on, the surroundings very thick forest. The figure was extremely tall as well. I have a very good memory, especially for details. Also, shortly before I noticed it, I got a very strong feeling that I was being watched. I never felt safe there again, and I was so glad my dad sold it. This incident happened to me when I was younger, probably around 19 or 20. I used to drive around the countryside in the woods for hours on end, up to literally 6 hours, smoke cigarettes while I listened to music daydreaming. I've been through a lot, so this is a nice way for me to let off steam and digest all the badness that happened to me in the past few years. There is a route that goes into the southern part of my state and eventually takes you to Maryland, if I'm not mistaken. If you keep going all the way, it will eventually take you to Florida. It was a road I found to be very fond as it intersected with a lot of interesting places. It could take you to cities and beaches alike, all the while somehow remaining isolated and rural. On one of those day trips, I was driving through a heavily wooded area that opens up into a field lined with trees on my left. I was pretty zoned out at this point, but something on the side of the road immediately caught my attention. In fact, it even seemed that time slowed, or I could see this apparition more vividly than any other thing I've ever seen in my life. What I saw was an older, balding man dressed in a full Catholic priest garb. His mouth is open, appearing to be in grief, screaming at the sky. He was standing in front of a dead deer, a buck. From what I recall, it was around 3 points, maybe 4. Behind the deer was a 1970s Crown Vic style police car with its lights on. It had no markings on it whatsoever to signify what country it's from. And no one's in the vehicle. I don't even think it had an engine running sound. It appeared as though the vehicle had been parked there all day. The other odd thing about this vehicle is that it has no damage on the front end to show that it's responsible for hitting the deer, nor was there any blood or anything. The deer seems fine. Taking a step back, trying to think of what I saw, it had the appearance of being staged or set up somehow, as if it was a prop for a movie. Everything was just so odd. For the speed I was travelling at, the glance I cast on this spectacle was only 4 seconds, but it so abruptly singed into my mind now. I have never seen anything like it. For some reason I started crying after seeing it. Did the forces that shaped time or something just merge and I saw something from back then? I don't know, I've even been on the same spot from this trip, and there's never a trace of it, not even the body of the deer or tyre tracks from the police car that could be seen. Like a breeze, it was gone. A thing so out of place it could not have been from its surroundings. I have no answers to any of these questions. Only a lack of closure for something that's scarring my brain.